Chapter 1353. Madara's everlasting city was a city built at the intersection of the Rothasher River and the River of Sudden Death. Rothasher meant eternal in the ancient language of the mountain people. These two rivers flowed south for more than 700 kilometers before emptying into the Sea of Everlasting Death at the Tochik region. The two rivers flowed through the most prosperous areas of Madara. Even in this land there were many humans living there. For example, in the capital of the undead, there were close to 120,000 humans, elves and other living creatures living there. The undead population was relatively small, unless the unintelligent low-level undead were included. With living creatures, there was a need for survival materials. Besides, the necromancers needed all kinds of materials, and the dark nobles needed ores, armor, weapons and all kinds of materials. Hence, commercial activities were born. Therefore, Madara's everlasting city was not the dark, silent, gloomy and desolate city that people imagined. The city was also full of its unique life. You could see shops, workshops and even mills and bars. There were also public buildings such as libraries and bathhouses. It was not much different from what you would see in other big cities of this era that were full of urban atmosphere. However, unlike the human cities in the southern border of Erewhon and the Cruz Empire, the undead cities were often solemn and quiet. Most of the buildings were tall and majestic, and were generally filled with religious colors. These buildings were often built with cold materials such as obsidian and marble, creating a solemn and well-defined atmosphere. As everyone knew, the undead worshipped order, and they were Martha's fanatics. Therefore in this city the streets and alleys were straight. You couldn't see random objects, messy alleys, wandering peddlers or illegally built buildings. The whole city gave off a faint militarized atmosphere. There were very few pedestrians on the streets. If it was not necessary, the residents of this city would rarely go out and chat. You could rarely see idle people because those who did not work would be turned into undead and thrown into the military camp. Here, the women's job was to give birth, and the men had to work for the prosperity of the Roman Black Rose. Everyone had something to do. In short, Madara did not keep idle people. As a traveler with a modern soul, Brando was not interested in this atmosphere. The diverse modern society advocated freedom and individuality. Although he was not a radical liberal, he was more or less influenced by it. He did not like this kind of ultra-conservative and militarized closed society. However, it was always easier to destroy order than to build it. Since the arrival of the goddess of the dead moon less than a week ago, the undead society had collapsed before his eyes. At this moment he was walking on a street with others. His eyes swept across the ruins of the buildings on the street. As far as his eyes could see, the street in the early morning was covered with a thin layer of fog, mixed with the dust on the ruins, forming a haze. The visibility on the street was extremely low. He did not use his special perception ability. He could only vaguely see people walking around in the fog in the distance, rummaging through the ruins for valuables. A week ago, this street used to be an orderly craftsman area. The bear goblin craftsmen who allied with the undead built armaments here for the necromancers. However, in the disaster the buildings collapsed one after another, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The street was also covered with terrible cracks, and occasionally, lava could be seen spewing out from them. Everywhere there were granite deposits formed by the accumulation of magma after it cooled down. The order of the undead had long disappeared. Now there were not many people left here. The dark nobles had evacuated the city as early as 3 days after the disaster, and the army continued to stay in the city to fight against the descendants of the evil gods. Later, the Queen of Madara evacuated most of the civilians. After that, the necromancers and the army under their command began to gradually withdraw from the city. Most of the people who were still in the city now missed the best time to evacuate or were abandoned. The undead did not have any guarantees for their people. They only made the most efficient choice. Seeing this group of people marching to the center of the city from afar, the refugees in the fog became restless and began to move closer. Most of these people were humans and elves in the city. They hoped to be taken out of the city, or at least to avoid the descendants of the evil gods. But obviously their hopes were dashed. Before they could get close, the Black Knight on the periphery of the group rushed over, raised his cold long sword and drove these people away. Seeing the Black Knight, these people showed a look of despair. The Black Knight was the most indifferent and ruthless creature among the undead. Moreover, the person who could control them must be a big figure among the dark nobles. Why would the big figure care about their life and death? Walking beside Brando, Huanghua saw this scene and frowned. She seemed to want to say something but seemed to have some concerns and did not speak. Brando noticed the look on his student's face. He turned to Queen Madara and said, "Those people are your people." "In the kingdom of the undead, there is no concept of people," Queen Madara said faintly. "There is only value. They used to be valuable so they could survive here. But now they have lost the value of their existence so they can only fend for themselves." Brando found it hard to imagine that such a kingdom could be cohesive, but there was no doubt that the people who lived here had accepted this logic from the moment they were born. And those who came to Madara from the outside world were all people who had escaped into the darkness and were exiled. Since they had chosen this path, they had to accept all the rules of the dark world. Taking these people out of here is as easy as lifting a finger for you. I never give alms. This is not alms. I ask you to do so, Brando replied firmly. Queen Madara frowned. Why? Brando looked at Huanghua beside him and replied, because this is my student's choice. As a teacher, I don't want her to express her thoughts because of other reasons. As he spoke, he said to Huanghua, it is not wrong to be compassionate. You are my student, so you don't have to worry about others. If you think it is right in your heart, then you should express it to strengthen your position and will. Huanghua was a little moved. She bowed deeply and said, Teacher, Huanghua understands. Meaningless action, Queen Madara replied. But I agree. This is because of your value. When I leave this city, I will take these burdens with me. In addition to the accompanying Black Knight, there were also Fang Qi, Mr. Liu and the others. Princess Magadal was also among them. Mr. Liu did not have much sympathy for these people of Madara, and his face was expressionless. Fang Qi obviously did not agree with Brando's point of view. He even pursed his lips. Only the nun princess's furrowed brows relaxed when she heard his explanation. Indeed, for Brando this action was meaningless. Perhaps he could save a few more people, but for the rest, it was just a drop in the bucket. Meanwhile, it had nothing to do with his sympathy. That was because he could not confirm whether those people were worth saving or not. He also did not have the time to differentiate between the good and the bad. He just had to tell his students that if they believed that they were right, they had to persevere. Being overly cautious, was that what a warrior would do? Fortunately, Huanghua seemed to have noticed this point. After this small interlude, the group continued to move forward. Their destination was the meditation's sacred ground in the holy temple of the dying moon. To be exact, it was the completed teleportation circle there. Ever since the descent of the goddess of the dying moon, the holy temple of the dying moon, which had suffered the most damage, had long been turned into a forbidden area. Now, the Black Knight directly under Her Majesty had firmly guarded the place. On one hand, it was to prevent people with evil intentions from entering, and on the other hand, it was to prevent the children of the evil god from escaping from the crack and destroying the teleportation circle. According to the agreement between Brando and the Queen of Madara, they would be teleported to the central area near the dying moon's inland sea to search for the legendary stagnation realm, solve the mystery of the emerald and find the nature's orb. And after sending them off, the undead would completely abandon the city. The undead would complete an unprecedented migration under the will of the Mercury staff. They would eventually split into two groups. One group would go to Erewhon or Cruz, and the other group would go east to Saint Tassol, if Freya's message of peace could be approved by the Wind Elves. Freya had already left the land of eternal death on a flying dragon earlier in the day, accompanied by the former marshal of the Antiburo Principality, Frank, and Lady White Mist. Brando knew that what she was about to bring back to Erewhon might not be a gentle reform, and with an expert like Frank accompanying her, the goddess of war's personal safety could at least be guaranteed. Moreover, for the alliance between Tanajil and the princess, the White Wolf Sword Saint was also a peak combat power that the alliance urgently needed. This was because Brando had already heard from Freya that Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles did not return to Erewhon. It was possible that, like Medisha, there was a problem with long-distance teleportation. And Lady White Mist's understanding of some of the secrets of the era before the war between the Twilight Dragon and the Holy Saints was enough to help the princess and Amandina sort out their thoughts on how to deal with the upcoming war against the Twilight Dragon. Moreover, she was also a powerful mage, although she rarely showed it. Chapter 1354. With the help of these two, Brando had reason to believe that Freya's journey would be much smoother, as long as there weren't any major changes in the Erewhon kingdom. On the other hand, Medisha and Hippamera had bid farewell to him nearly a week ago and were heading to the Planeswalker training grounds with the seven-pole dragon queen, Fuchsia. According to the evil dragon king, they might be able to make it in time for the upcoming adventure. However, Brando had already told the two ladies in advance that if they couldn't make it to the central area of the Dead Moon Sea to meet him after the training grounds, Fuchsia would bring them back to Erewhon to help Freya and the princess quell any unrest that might arise in the kingdom. Because according to Queen Madara, the alliance of the dragons and the Kurlets had suffered a huge defeat in East Metz. Although there was no news of how heavy the losses were, the death of Owen Los meant that the dragons had lost their last dragon king at this moment. Under such circumstances, the only dragon queen left was the exiled Fuchsia. If Fuchsia were to return at this time, she might really be able to regain the throne of the dragon queen. And if Fuchsia were to head to Cruz to take on this heavy responsibility, then Medisha and Hippamera would be on the same route as her. In the end, Andrea and the Silver Elf had to travel with the migrating undead. The only ones left who could complete the mission with Brando were Huanghua, Fangqi and Delphian. Mr. Liu also chose to participate in this mission because he had to travel with the Jade Phoenix Queen. As for the people around Fangqi who originally belonged to the Phantom Chariot, Brando dismissed them. A few elders were handed over to the Queen of Madara for her to monitor. The only exception was Princess Magadal. Originally, Brando wanted to let the princess return to Erewhon with Blanche and find a way to return to the Antiburo Duchy from Erewhon. But he didn't expect Andrea to suggest bringing the princess along. Princess Magadal also expressed her wish, and it was said that it had something to do with her background. Brando couldn't reject this reason and had no choice but to agree. That was why she appeared in this team. In fact, ever since the Nun Princess obtained the Book of Gaia, Andrea and her Goddess of War colleagues had been taking turns to teach her how to use the power of the Creator. Although the princess had almost never participated in a real battle, the instincts and memories of the other personality buried deep in her soul were still present. Her learning progress was quite good, and she could be considered to have the strength to protect herself. Brendel did not think too much about the princess's combat prowess, but he did not reject her because he had promised Blanc. Besides, he was also very curious about the secrets of the Silver Plains. The withered and dilapidated scene of the City of the Undead seemed to have affected the mood of the people in the team. Except for the argument, not many people spoke along the way. Fang Qi pulled out the sacred jade sword from the scabbard from time to time and carefully wiped it, looking a little bored. Mr. Liu didn't say a word, and his expression was solemn, not much different from usual. Both Princess Magadal and Huanghua seemed to have a lot on their minds. The former was obviously worried about her background, while the latter was worried about the legends of the Twilight War that she had heard over and over again. In any case, this princess of the Jade Phoenix bloodline didn't forget her identity. What she cared about, besides her own cultivation, was the future of the Nine Phoenix Kingdom. Soon the team arrived at the Dying Moon Temple. This temple looked even more shocking than a few days ago. This temple used to be the tallest and most majestic building in the City of the Undead, but now there was almost no sign of the solemn and sacred aura of the past. The main body of the temple had almost collapsed, leaving only a thin wall that was on the verge of collapse, as if it would collapse at any time if a gust of wind blew past. As far as the eye could see, there was an endless stretch of ruins. Only a small number of side palace buildings could survive, but most of them were severely damaged. There were either terrible cracks on the surface, or there was a problem with the internal support structure. Although the whole building didn't seem to have any problems on the surface, the foundation was actually faintly tilting in one direction. The side hall where the meditation sanctum was located was one of them. Because Queen Madara had long expected the fall and descent of the goddess of the undead, she had reinforced the place where the teleportation circle was built. Therefore, the building where the meditation sanctum was located was the best preserved part of the temple at this moment. The Black Knight was patrolling the periphery of this temple at this moment. This was the central area where the goddess of the undead descended, but because of some powerful undead creatures, there were the least number of descendants of the Diablo here. In fact, after a few days of fierce fighting, most of the descendants of the Diablo were driven to the east of the city. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many refugees here. Because Queen Madara was accompanying them, the Black Knight turned a blind eye to Brando and the others, and the group quickly filed into the meditation sanctum. The altar that Delphian saw a week ago had been completed. Brando walked through the courtyard of the meditation sanctum and saw the portal. It looked similar to the door of flame in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. A circular arch stood on the altar, and the arch was covered with various patterns. With Brando's elementalist level, he obviously couldn't understand a word of this level of magic runes. However, most spatial magic was similar, so it wasn't surprising that it was exactly the same as the portal in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He noticed that at this moment, the figures of the undead and the bear goblin craftsmen that he saw a few days ago could no longer be seen around the altar. There were only 22 wizards in black robes in a circle, each holding a bone staff. These people were obviously the wizards who would be in charge of the activation of the magic array later. There was no peerless master like the great sage of the Cruz Empire in Madara, so to activate a teleportation array of this level, they could only rely on numbers. Brando could see at a glance that these black-robed wizards were all liches, and each of them had at least the strength of elemental activation or even elemental enlightenment. The strength of these liches was not at the top in Madara, and they barely reached the upper level of combat power. Queen Madara had left them here, obviously with the idea that in case of an accident, they could be abandoned. From this point, Brando once again felt the way the undead did things, cold and direct. In fact, Brendel had already experienced long-distance teleportation when he was outside of the elemental border. The teleportation gate built by the undead was a directional teleportation gate, which was much more stable and safe than the one Medisa and the others used in Rushta. It was not something that could be compared to the teleportation gate that he used to pass through the space turbulence. Therefore, Brando did not appear to be nervous, and walked directly to the teleportation altar. Next was Phoenix Flame. As the princess of the Jade Phoenix bloodline, she was obviously no stranger to teleportation, and calmly followed her teacher to the altar. Fang Qi, Mr. Liu and Delphian were also quite calm, but Princess Magadal, who had experienced long-distance teleportation, was a little nervous, and her face was a little pale. Brando comforted her in a low voice, temporarily diverting the princess's attention and calming her down. After everyone had walked to the altar, the Queen of Madara looked up and said, "Before you leave, I have to remind you that the dangers of this trip are unpredictable, and I can't guarantee that you can come back alive. In fact, I have another set of plans, and if you can't come back, I have a way to deal with it." Brando knew that she was talking about the agreement between Haku and Ekis, but before he could say anything, the Prime Minister's daughter beside him smiled and said, "Your Majesty, since the dangers are unpredictable, then there is nothing to say. Lady Martha is protecting us." The Queen of Madara shook her head coldly and said, "The will of the Roman Black Rose is that if there is a chance, and if there is value, we are willing to accept any price. For the undead, there is nothing more terrible than eternal death, but even if it is eternal death, we can face it calmly. However, for a weak race like you can't understand our coldness not only to others but also to ourselves. We will not leave any last words because it is meaningless, but I think you may have additional requests. Your Majesty, please take back your words." Phoenix Flame raised her head and said firmly, "The inheritor of the Jade Phoenix also has the courage to face everything, even death. Otherwise we would not have chosen this path." "But death is not terrible, little girl. You will never understand that," the Queen of Madara replied. Brando saw that the argument was going to continue, so he frowned and interrupted the Queen, "Leave the last words to others. I have a question for you, Your Majesty." The Queen of Madara looked back at him and said, "Speak." "For Madara, if you want to reconcile with Saint Tassol and Fanzin, there is a better choice than Erwin, isn't there?" "You mean the Bugas?" The Queen of Madara seemed to have expected this question. Brendel nodded. This was actually a question that had been in his heart for a long time. He had suppressed this question for a long time before finally asking. Even though he had some guesses in his heart, he still hoped to get a definite answer from the other party. After the Fallen Moon disaster, the Bugas lost their kingdom in the sky. Now the speed of information transmission between the continents is slower than in any previous era. The Bugas can't teleport back and forth between their monitoring point and the floating city like in the past, so they may not have time to know everything that is happening here, the Queen of Madara replied, but this is only one of the reasons. The second reason is that the relationship between the Bugas and the Wind Elves may not be as good as you think. What do you mean? Brando's heart skipped a beat and asked. The Bugas have always been in conflict with the four empires. Whether it is the Cruz, Fanzin, or the Wind Elves, they are not happy that someone is above them and telling them what to do. Moreover, before the Fallen Moon disaster, a considerable number of the Bugas had actually returned to the Earth. In order to fight for the slate, there was a lot of friction between them and the Wind Elves and Fanzin. In fact, as far as the last news I received, a branch of the Bugas was in a state of war with the Wind Elves. Although a full-scale war has not broken out, the Wind Elves may not choose to believe their enemy at this time. Brando completely understood when he heard this. Although history had deviated greatly, at least at this moment, it still stubbornly maintained its inertia. The Slate War still broke out, and the friction between the Bugas and the Wind Elves in history was the fuse of this war. But this was just the beginning, and there would be more serious things to come. After listening to the Queen of Madara's words, Brando was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "If your Majesty really wants to reconcile with the Wind Elves and Fanzin, and wants to fight against the Twilight Dragon, I have two things to warn your majesty. Chapter 1355. Suddenly 6 doors of light appeared in the wilderness. Brendel, Magadol, Mr. Lu, Delphine, Huanghua, and Fang Qi stepped out of the doors one after another. Then they stepped into a patch of muddy ground. Damn it, what the hell is this place? Fang Qi immediately frowned. He had put on a black dragon-patterned overcoat, but now the hem of his overcoat was completely soaked in the muddy water, and it was covered with rotten grass. However, before the others could mock him, they heard a plop. It turned out that because Huanghua was too short, he lost his footing and fell into the quagmire when he took a step forward. Miss? Young lady Huanghua. Everyone was flustered and exclaimed. Ah, my dear cousin, please get up. There's no need to be so polite. Fang Qi laughed as if he had forgotten about his predicament. Huanghua clenched her teeth and climbed out of the mud. Her princess warrior suit was covered in mud and grass. Her hair was also covered in mud and water. The mud was falling down like a waterfall. Feeling wronged, she wiped her face with her arm, revealing her snow-white forehead under the mud. She turned around and stared coldly at Fang Qi. Are you okay? Brendel was speechless. He looked at his student biting her lower lip with a pale face, afraid that she would pull out her sword in anger. Huanghua had always been clean, and this was worse than taking her life. Fortunately, Huanghua had a calm and steady personality. Although she felt terrible, she could only shake her head. The height of the portal was nothing to her, but who would have guessed that there was a huge swamp below the portal? Magadol pulled the little princess to one side and took out some spare clothes from her backpack. Fortunately, she knew that this trip would take them through the lowland swamps in the northern part of the Dead Moon Inland Sea, so she was prepared in advance. Brando smiled bitterly and shook his head. His student's luck was really bad. Take this. He took out the cloak of the King of Giants from the floating celestial sphere and handed it over. He wondered if the King of Giants would be so angry that he would come back to life if he knew that his cloak was used by a little lady as a curtain to change clothes. Huanghua took the cloak with both hands. She understood what her teacher meant and nodded gratefully. Magadol took the cloak from her hands and brought her to a dry hill not far away. She then opened the curtain and hid the little princess behind it. The Prime Minister's daughter, Delphine, turned around and said to the 3 men with a smile, My lord, Fang Qi and Mr. Lu, would you gentlemen please excuse yourselves? Magadol did not know how sharp the eyes and ears of elemental awakeners were, but Delphine was very attentive. The mound where Phoenix Fire and the Nun Princess were was not too far from here, so it was obviously not suitable. Brando could not help but feel a little awkward. He did not think of taking advantage of his student, but he did not think of this point. He and Mr. Lu nodded together, accepting Delphine's advice. Only Fang Qi snorted in disdain. As he walked away, he muttered under his breath, Who would be interested in that washboard? It's a pity that Miss Delphine's heart belongs to someone else, and I'm not that guy's opponent. Mr. Lu and Brendel pretended not to hear his mutterings. After so many days, although the relationship between the Ghost Chariot and the Jade Phoenix clan was still not too harmonious, Mr. Lu already knew what kind of strange personality this genius of the Ghost Chariot, who was known as the Ghost Chariot's 1-in-1,000 years genius, had. His attention was already focused on the surrounding environment. As he walked away with Brando, he asked, Mr. Brando, where is this place? Brando looked around. This was obviously the central area of a wetland. The terrain was very flat and there were low meadows all around. The grass was covered with shallots, long-stalked marigolds, reeds and other vegetation. Looking carefully, he could even see large clumps of mushrooms and bird nests in the grass. A little further away there was a connected pool. The water surface was as smooth as a mirror, as if it was embedded in the ground. As the wetland was shrouded in a thin layer of fog, the water surface was a little gloomy, and it was covered with water plants like water caltrops. Other than the crooked tree on the mound where Phoenix Fire and Magadol were, there was not a single tree in the fog. Brando used his dark perception and mind's eye ability to expand his range of perception to a few miles, and it was the same. This was obviously the lowland swamp to the north of the inland sea of the Dead Moon. The Sudden Death River and Rosacher River flowed into the inland sea of the Dead Moon, and the alluvial delta of the 2 rivers formed a large area of lowland. In addition, it was said that this land had been hit by a meteorite in the chaotic era, forming a small basin. The seawater flowed backwards, forming a large area of salt marshes near the sea. However, this place looked very lively, and it should not be the salt marshes near the sea. Brando quickly confirmed this and replied, When Queen Madara set up this teleportation point, she had sent people to investigate this place. This place is actually located at the edge of Tokik. Tokik is close to the eternal land of Madara, and to the east, it is connected to the territory ruled by the undead. Because of the conflict between the Empire and the undead, this is actually an ungoverned area. Lord Tokik is holed up in Tokik City, which is very far from here, so it is not actually the owner of this place. There are no trade caravans in the swamp, so there are no corresponding robbers and water bandits. However, in the year of the Golden Cup, a group of secret believers came here and took over this land. This is actually an area controlled by the Sheep's Head cult. They also built a few towns, one of which should be directly south of us, called Malta. Brando said according to the book. This information was given to him by Queen Madara, and there was also a map corresponding to it. In fact, even he could not be familiar with every area in Wonde, but for an emperor of the empire, this problem was very simple. Mr. Lu nodded and did not ask the naive question of why a group of Sheep's Head cult gathered here, but why Her Majesty Madara and the Waning Moon Temple were indifferent. The queen with the Mercury staff was very scheming, and naturally had her own political considerations and plans. Before the empire took action against the undead, she obviously would not easily intervene in Tokik's affairs. As for the current situation, it was even more impossible. Not long after, Huanghua changed her clothes and caught up with Magadol and Delphian. Fang Qi commented on the little princess attire again, which made Huanghua frown. However, Brando's eyes lit up. Probably because she was trekking in the swamp, Huanghua had changed into a neat tight warrior's outfit, and her long black hair was tied into a ponytail. She held a sword in one hand and looked like a heroic little beauty. The information given to him by Queen Madara said that this was the territory of the Sheep's Head cult, and it did not seem to be an exaggeration. Sure enough, it did not take long before they bumped into a group of black-robed cult members. In fact, the other party did not notice Brando and the others at all. Brando's will and perception were originally different from ordinary people. Coupled with his dark perception and mind's eye ability, he discovered the existence of these people through the mist from a few miles away. Therefore, when Brando and the others appeared in front of these people, these black-robed cult members were obviously a little surprised, and after a moment of shock, they pulled out their weapons from under their robes. However, they obviously misjudged the situation they were facing. Brando could smell the sulfur on these people from afar. In this world, only one kind of people would be so disgusting, and these black-robed people were undoubtedly the Sheep's Head cult members. After confirming this, he no longer held back and directly reached out his hand. The law of space and time surged out, and from a distance of nearly 100 meters, he pulled the leader of the Sheep's Head cult members out of the crowd and fixed him in midair. The leader of the Sheep's Head cult wanted to say a few words, or use the demon language to intimidate these ignorant people in front of him, but before he could finish his words, he felt himself being lifted into the air. For a moment, he could not help but be horrified, and the words he had prepared were naturally stuck in his throat. The remaining more than a dozen black-robed people obviously reacted. The opponent's performance was at least above the elemental level. Of course, in fact, above the elemental level was not possible, but the strongest of these Sheep's Head cult members were only elemental awakeners, and their imagination was not so rich. They knew that they were far from the opponent, and after looking at each other, they turned around and ran. Unfortunately, Brando did not intend to let these people go. If the hatred between Madara and Erwin was only due to the different political positions of the countries, then these cultists were undoubtedly the public enemy of all the creatures of order in this world. He raised the leader of the Sheep's Head cult members in his left hand, and at the same time raised his right hand and gently slashed at the escaping cultists. The silver law of space swept forward like a wave with him as the center, and in the blink of an eye, caught up with the Sheep's Head cult members one by one. The Sheep's Head cult members suddenly ran slower and slower, and the space and time around them seemed to be imprisoned. In the end, they could only maintain a single movement in place like a motionless statue. Brando turned his head and said to the others, "Go and kill them, but remember to keep their robes, we still need them." Mr. Lu and Delphian immediately nodded, and the Prime Minister's daughter even pulled out her sword. Princess Magadol hesitated for a moment and followed. Fang Qi was a little reluctant when he heard that he might have to wear the sulfuric robes, but he still pulled out the Jade Dragon sword and followed. Huanghua was the last to move, but Brando stopped her. Chapter 1356. I'll leave this to you. Don't kill him. I still have something to ask him. Brendel loosened his grip, and the leader of the sheephead cult fell from the air and landed on the ground like a dog eating mud. He had already seen that the leader of the sheephead cult had the strength of elemental activation. He was perfect to be Huanghua's opponent. Although Huang Hua's strength was a level higher than this guy's, it would be a challenge to capture him alive instead of killing him. Huang Hua obviously understood her teacher's meaning. Her dark eyes lit up slightly, and she drew her sword to meet the enemy. The sheep-head cult's fighting style was very strange. His weapon was a long whip burning with flames. While using the long whip to force Huang Hua to keep a distance from him, he could also chant a spell to summon a crimson little demon. Originally, for Huang Hua, it would only take 1 or 2 moves to end this person's life with the Desert Wind swordsmanship. The Desert Wind swordsmanship was a top swordsmanship for both long-range and short-range attacks. The guy thought that he could make Huang Hua unable to do anything to him by keeping a distance. Obviously he was wrong. However, Brando asked Huang Hua to capture the sheep-head cult member alive instead of killing him, which limited her opportunity to use the Desert Wind swordsmanship. After all, the Desert Wind swordsmanship was the sword of the Red Lotus of Hellfire. It was the most lethal of the 3 swords of the 9 Phoenix. If she was not careful, she might not even be able to leave a complete corpse, let alone capture him alive. In addition, the little demons summoned by the sheep-head cult member were very difficult to deal with. Although their strength was only in the middle of the gold level, they had thick skin and inherited the consistent characteristics of hell creatures. They had strong regenerative abilities, were resistant to electricity and fire, and were not afraid of death. There were several opportunities for Huang Hua to get close to them, but she was blocked by these little demons. The leader of the sheep-head cult was obviously very experienced. As he retreated, he summoned 7 or 8 little demons. Brando knew that the opponent was still wary of him. Otherwise, he would have escaped from Huang Hua's attack range. He frowned. The number of little demons around Huang Hua had almost reached double digits. If his student could not think of a way, not to mention capturing the opponent alive, even defeating the opponent would be a problem. The leader of the sheep-head cult was obviously aware of this. There was a hint of joy in his eyes. He ignited the last demon scroll and threw it out, then suddenly turned and ran. The red parchment he threw out turned into ashes in the air. Sparks and shredded paper rose into the air and formed a flaming gate. A chain demon overlord strode out of the flaming gate and raised its right hand. Following a clattering noise, a black iron chain with a spiked iron ball flew toward Phoenix Fire. Brando could not help but shake his head when he saw this. Although Huang Hua's performance was remarkable, she was still too methodical. 9 Phoenix's 3 supreme swords were still binding her, making her think of how to defeat her opponent fair and square. This was the typical thought of a swordsman. He asked Huang Hua to capture the opponent alive, but the capture did not necessarily mean that the opponent would be unharmed. There were a few times when Huang Hua could easily win by cutting off the opponent's legs and hands. However, as a swordsman, Huang Hua persisted in her pursuit of perfection. For a real warrior, this was not a good thing. Other than fighting and winning, everything else was superfluous for a real warrior. The chain demon overlord was already an upper-middle demon in the scorching hell. Although he did not know how the leader of the sheep-head cult, who was only elemental activated, summoned this thing, Brando was ready to make a move. He was worried that Huang Hua would be injured in the battle. But at this time, a bright and dazzling sword light was reflected in his eyes. Brando stopped what he was doing. The moment before the chain demon overlord's attack arrived, Huang Hua threw the sword in her hand out from the encirclement of the imps. With a ding sound, it hit the spiked ball accurately, knocking the iron spiked ball aside. It swept past several imps, bringing with it a whirlwind of flesh and blood. But Huang Hua lowered her body and grabbed the metal chain. She gritted her teeth and her small body was swept up by the chain. Then she let go and took advantage of the momentum to jump, landing in front of the leader of the sheep-head cult, who had escaped a considerable distance at this time. Huang Hua landed and rolled, splashing water. The leader of the sheep-head cult only saw a flash in front of his eyes, and then he saw the little girl in front of him rushing towards him with a determined look. Damn it! He yelled angrily, but in the previous battle, he had already seen that the little girl was a swordsman. When she used the sword, she could only fight to a draw with him. At this moment, she had abandoned her sword and dared to come close to him. She was looking for death. But it just so happened that the leader of the sheep-head cult was not surprised but happy. He thought that if he could catch the little girl to threaten the terrible guy before, he might be able to escape. Thinking of this, he took out the long whip from his arms again. The long whip was gently flung, and a raging flame had already ignited on it. Unfortunately, although the idea was good, it had to be realized in time. The leader of the sheep-head cult raised the long whip and was about to swing it down, but he found that a white little hand had reached out first. He was horrified to see that the little hand was ignited with the same bright and red flame, grabbing his whip. "This is impossible." The leader of the sheephead cult screamed in horror, "My flame whip!" Before he had finished speaking, Huanghua had already stepped into the range of him. Her left hand pulled the long whip in her direction, and her right hand clenched into a fist as red as fire. The red lotus hellfire spewed out from between her fingers. From bottom to top, she punched the sheephead cult leader's chin heavily. There was a crisp sound, and the leader of the sheephead cult's chin suddenly shattered. His whole body flew high and then fell heavily into the pool. He struggled on the ground twice to get up, but the injury was too serious. Soon he lost his strength and lay on the ground again. As soon as the leader of the sheephead cult fell, the little demon and the chain demon lord that he had maintained with his spiritual power suddenly disappeared, as if they had never existed. Huanghua was covered in mud, and the clothes that she had just changed into were all destroyed, but she seemed to be unaware of it. She stood in the mud and gasped for breath. When Brando walked over, he saw the little princess wiping her face with her hands. Not only did she not wipe her face clean, but her face was even more messy, like a little cat. She gasped for breath for a while, then straightened her chest and looked at her teacher. At that moment, Brando saw that his student's dark eyes were surrounded by golden flames, and it flashed by. Talent awakening. Brando was shocked and could not help but be stunned. Huanghua was obviously a sign of the awakening of the talent of fate. She had also used the sword of red lotus hellfire after abandoning her sword. It was obviously related to this talent. The problem was that this was too outrageous. She could awaken the corresponding talent immediately after abandoning her sword? If it was really so easy, then there would be many swordsmen in the world who would abandon their swords. And how old was Huanghua? Brando could not help but look at his student deeply. He deeply felt what was called the protagonist's halo. Compared with him, a cheater who relied on cheating to awaken the talent of fate, the little princess in front of him was obviously the real son of Martha, the one who was favored by the goddess of fate. Red Lotus Martial Soul. Mr. Liu came back at some point. The bright blade in his hand was still dripping with blood, and the other hand was holding a few black robes. He obviously just saw the scene of Huanghua knocking down the leader of the sheephead cult. He couldn't help but exclaim and rushed over, looking at his young lady in shock. "Teacher?" Huanghua bowed deeply to Brando. "Thank you." After Mr. Liu's explanation, Brando understood what the Red Lotus Martial Soul was, in fact, the so-called awakening of the talent of fate by players. However, in the Amber Sword, the awakening of the two talents of fate by players was inevitable. They only needed to complete the corresponding quest chain to awaken. But for the indigenous people, the talent of fate was an illusory thing. Except for a few chosen ones or very talented geniuses, few people could awaken the talent of fate. And a shortcut to awakening the talent of fate was to become a favored one, such as the Twin Moons family, the son of Martha. This talent of fate was the so-called chosen one, or Brando's chosen one was also one of them. But unfortunately, the gods had long passed away. To become a favored one was probably not easier than relying on one's own talent of fate. The Red Lotus Martial Soul of Nine Phoenix was a special talent of fate. This talent of fate was hidden in the two royal bloodlines of Ghost Chariot and Jade Phoenix. As long as one practiced the Desert Wind swordsmanship or the White Raven swordsmanship, and at the same time was a genius and outstanding person in these two bloodlines, there was a certain chance to awaken the Red Lotus Martial Soul, White Raven Martial Soul. This talent of fate was fixed. Once it appeared, it could allow people to truly master the power of the Red Lotus Hellfire, instead of relying on the Desert Wind swordsmanship to exert its power. This special talent of fate had a higher chance of awakening than a normal talent of fate, but it was still very rare. It was unknown if Huanghua had been lucky enough to awaken this talent of fate, or if Brando had taught her well. Brando thought it was the former, but Huanghua and Mr. Liu firmly believed it was the latter. Therefore, the two of them had the highest respect for Brando. The little princess could not help but invite Brando to Nine Phoenix to become her teacher. In Nine Phoenix, the status of a teacher was very high. A teacher for a day was a father for life. If Brando agreed, then with his identity as the Jade Phoenix's inheritor and Nine Phoenix's royal daughter's teacher, he could directly enter the upper echelons of the empire. His status was even higher than many of the royal relatives of the Nine Phoenix kingdom. However, Brando still declined. To be honest, with his current strength, it was not difficult for him to obtain authority, but that was not what he wanted. He had chosen Huanghua to be his student mostly because he saw her rare talent. He could teach this little princess. In the future, if he had the chance, he could even go to Nine Phoenix to see her. However, it was impossible for her to stay in Nine Phoenix. He still had a lot of things to deal with in Erewhon, so he did not want to get involved in another quagmire. Chapter 1357. Brando came to the sheephead cult leader's side and looked at the guy's condition. He could not help but smile bitterly. The sheephead cult leader's chin had been completely smashed by Huanghua's punch. His mouth was full of blood and he was lying in the mud like a dead fish. How was he going to interrogate him? He looked back at Huanghua, and the latter stuck out her tongue in embarrassment. "Leave it to me, I have a way to make him talk." It was Fang Qi who spoke. He had walked back with the sheephead cult leader's body in his hand. He probably disdained to do such a thing as stripping clothes. He threw the body in his hand onto a nearby dry mound and said, "You?" Brando looked at this guy in surprise. The big expression on his face was probably because he did not expect this guy to come in handy. He brought this guy on this trip purely because he might need his blood to enter the stagnation realm. "Humph, I don't want to wear those stinky robes." "Aren't you going to Maltaha?" "I won't enter the city. I'll wait for you in the wilderness." "That's your condition?" Brando had a strange look on his face. "You won't enter the city?" "Don't worry, I swear in the name of Ghost Chariot that I will never sneak away alone. Besides, I'm also interested in the mystery of the jadeite." "Well, if you insist." Brando hurriedly interrupted this guy. He lifted the sheephead cult leader from the mud and threw him to him. "We will only stop for a while in Malta. You only need to stay in the wilderness for a few hours. When the time comes, wait for us in the south of the town. Don't go too far. I will contact you through the messaging crystal." Fang Qi took the sheephead cult leader and nodded. Although this guy was unsociable, he did have his own means. He quickly got the answer Brando wanted from the sheephead cult leader's mouth. Brando didn't know how this guy made the sheephead disciple with a broken jaw express his thoughts so accurately, but seeing Fang Qi's expression of disdain to talk about it, it should be the Ghost Chariot secret. Everyone had their own secrets, so Brando naturally wouldn't force it. According to the information he got from the leader of the sheephead cult, these sheephead cult members were heading south to Marta. This was not out of Brendel's expectations as there was only one town in the swamps to the south. He asked Fang Qi to ask the sheephead cult leader what they were going to Maltaha for. The answer was that they were going to Daharlan through Maltaha to participate in a ritual there. Daharlan Port was a port city on the sea within the Dead Moon. It was in the south of Maltaha and was nominally under the jurisdiction of Madara. The owner of Daharlan Port was the Holduri family, a dark aristocratic family with a long history. This family firmly controlled Daharlan's port, Chamber of Commerce and large and small guilds through an organization called Grey Scepter. According to the information provided by the Queen of Madara, the upper echelons of this organization were almost all composed of secret sheephead cult members. The current head of the Holduri family was also a follower of the sheephead cult. When Brando first saw this information, he could not help but sigh in his heart. It seemed that although Madara was abandoned by all for one, it was not a pure land in the country. There were also evil beliefs running rampant. First there were tree herders, then there were sheephead cult members. Every family had their own problems. However, the ritual mentioned by the sheephead cult leader caught his attention. The cultists of Wond would perform some evil rituals every 2 or 3 days, such as live sacrifice, blood sacrifice, or summoning demons. Of course, the object of the live sacrifice and blood sacrifice was not necessarily human or other intelligent creatures. Livestock such as cattle and sheep could also be used. But often, intelligent creatures were used as the object of the live sacrifice, so it must be a very high-level ritual. It just so happened that the ritual mentioned by the sheephead cult leader was a high-level ritual. The sheephead cult members had spread the news through their private communication channels as early as half a month ago, allowing the sheephead cult members in the Taoki region to gather in Daharlan to participate in the live sacrifice ritual that was expected to be held in 3 days. Brando asked about the content of the live sacrifice ritual, but he got very few answers. It seemed that the leader of the sheephead cult was just a temporary convener. He only knew the approximate time and scale of the live sacrifice ritual, and he did not know anything else. For such a person Brando had no pity. After asking all the information he asked Fang Qi to deal with him so that he could be sent to Martha to repent. However, when Fang Qi pulled out his sword and was about to attack, the man seemed to have realized his situation. He struggled in fear and screamed out another piece of information, intending to exchange for his worthless life. Unfortunately, Fang Qi was indifferent to this and sent him on his way with a single slash. The latter returned to Brendel's side and relayed the last words that the leader of the sheephead cult had shouted. It meant that the leader of the sheephead cult had heard from other people that the ritual was related to the opening of the Holy Land of Atuk. What is the sacred land of Atuk? Brando asked. No one in the room could answer this question. Brando was a little speechless at Fang Chi's decisiveness, but fortunately this question was not important. The sacred land of Atuk was obviously a place that only the sheephead cult members knew about. There were not many things in this area, but there were many disgusting people. When they reached Maltaha, there would be plenty of opportunities to inquire about this information. Therefore, after giving Fang Chi an annoyed look, he ordered the others to change into the sheephead disciples' robes. Except for Mr. Liu, the three ladies all expressed different degrees of unwelcome to the stinky robes. The Prime Minister's daughter was the first to put on the robes with a disgusted look. Then she put on the hood and quickly took it off. She immediately took a deep breath, and her face seemed to have paled a little. Then it was Magadal. The nun princess held the robe helplessly with a determined look on her face, as if it was not a robe but a rope on the gallows. As long as she put it on, she would immediately suffocate to death. Brendel watched as the princess gritted her teeth, as if she had made up her mind. Only then did she put on the robe and her whole body swayed twice. Only Huang He remained calm. This little princess even took out a pair of scissors, needle and thread from her bag. She cut the long robe and made it a size smaller to fit her body. Brendel was a little stunned for a moment. Mr. Liu explained to him that the little princess of the Jade Phoenix bloodline was quite clever with her hands. Most of her clothes were designed and tailored by herself. Brendel couldn't help but have a whole new level of respect for this little princess who was supposed to live a life of luxury when he heard this news. But before he finished sighing, he saw Huang He's expression of disgust. She sprinkled layers of spices on the robe, and then covered her face with a silk scarf before putting on the robe. Fortunately, most of the sheephead disciples were people who hid their heads and tails, and covering their faces was more in line with their characteristics. In fact, Huang He's actions were quickly followed by the two ladies. The little princess seemed to have been prepared, and took out 2 silk scarves and spices, which made Magadal and Delphian very grateful. Seeing this scene, Brando could not help but be a little puzzled. He could not help but lift his sleeve and sniff. Was it really that smelly? As a result, this action immediately made his stomach churn. Even with the level of the perfect body in the sage domain, he almost vomited. Martha above, how long has it been since these damn people took a bath? As for Fang Chi, he had already said that he would not wear these robes even if he was beaten to death. After Brando and he agreed on the rendezvous point, the group split into 2 and headed directly to Malta. The teleportation point was not far from Maltaha, and not long after, there were traces of human activity in the wetland swamp. Along the way they also bumped into a few groups of sheephead disciples who were also heading in the direction of Maltaha. Fortunately, the sheephead disciples were more reclusive, and there was not much interaction between different groups. Although both sides had the same destination, most of the time when they met each other, they would just look at each other and guard against the possibility of separating again. At most, they would just greet each other and ask where each other came from. And Brando had already asked the relevant information from the leader of the sheephead disciples, so he made up an identity. Anyway, no one would investigate carefully. The sheephead disciples were followers of the demons and chaos, and their actions were chaotic, so there should not be any big loopholes. Soon, the shadow of a town appeared in the mist. The town in the swamp was obviously not too big. Maltaha was a town, but in fact, it was just a temporary stop for travelers on the road to Dahalan. Even if there were some permanent residents, there would not be too many. Therefore, the scale of Maltaha was not much bigger than a village. The town had more hotels than ordinary villages and towns, and it was also for the convenience of passers-by. Of course, in this area, there were no serious pedestrians or tourists, mainly for the convenience of the sheephead disciples' pilgrimage. Brendel had already inquired before this. The port of Daharlan was the headquarters of the sheephead cult in the Takik region, and the current head of the Hajalai family was also the grand patriarch of this region. The sheephead disciples were different from the tree herders. This cult did not have an obvious tree-like structure of a high-level organization, and it could be seen all over Wonde. However, the sheephead disciples had almost no contact with each other, and the chief, of various sizes, managed the followers in different areas. Most of these chief did not know each other, and it was possible that they would not have any contact with each other in their lives. This was a scattered organization. But since the head of the Hajalai family could bear the title of chief, at least it meant that the head of the Hajalai family was the chief of the sheephead disciples in the Takik area. Chapter 1358. Seeing the roof appear in the mist, Brando couldn't help but feel a little impatient. What he wanted to do most now was to find a place to take a bath and get rid of the weird smell on his damn clothes. Although the sulfur smell on the robes of the Sheep's Head cult members was a way to identify each other, the smell of sweat on the robes and some unknown stench was superfluous. Although he had only been in the swamp for a few hours, Brando was already feeling a little dizzy. It wasn't that he didn't disguise himself as a Sheep's Head cult member in the game, but the game was still a game. Although it claimed to be 100% realistic, there were still a lot of things that weren't realistic. Just this little difference made the once naive him almost cry. There were many inns in the town. In the end, Brando chose an inn called Token's Boots that didn't look very good. It wasn't that he couldn't stay in the most luxurious and comfortable inn in the town, nor was it that he didn't want to find a clean and comfortable place to take care of his belongings in this damp and cold place. In fact, when Magadal, the nun princess, passed by the cleanest and most comfortable inn in the town, she almost couldn't walk. His student, Miss Phoenix Flame, also showed a look of reluctance as she stared at the luxurious inn opposite them. She wanted to speak a few times, but in the end she held back and didn't say anything. Because everyone knew that they were now playing the role of a group of poor and destitute Sheep's Head cult members. In fact, like most cults, most of the Sheep's Head cult members were poor. Except for a few people, they would obviously attract attention if they stayed in the most luxurious inn. Brando didn't want to attract attention, so he could only bear with it. Fortunately, although the inn was small, it had all the essentials. There was also a slightly clean single room and a place to bathe. The wetland swamp was cold and wet, and for travelers, it was a necessary requirement to have a clean and comfortable bath. Brando first sent the two ladies and his student to deal with his personal matters. In fact, it was to take a bath and change clothes. Fortunately, there was magic in this world, and cleaning clothes only required a little space and a few minutes, so it wouldn't delay things. While he and Mr. Liu went to the hall on the first floor of the inn to inquire about information. After a drink, he asked about some information about the Holy Land of Atuk. As Brando expected, this information wasn't a secret, because the Sheep's Head cult members gathered in Tokike was actually because of this Holy Land. This Holy Land was one of the sealed places of the great demon Akentu. Like the disciples of the Black Flame, the Sheep's Head cult members worshipped demons, but they didn't worship all demons. Their real master was actually only one, and that was the King of Purgatory, Sheep's Head Akentu. Sheep's Head Akentu once led a demon army to invade the surface world, but was defeated by the Dark Dragon. His soul was put into a crystal ball by the Bugas and secretly sealed. The location of this sealed place was unknown after the War of the Holy Saints. There were many areas in the world of Wone that were suspected to be sealed by Akentu, and Tokike was one of them. Brando then understood why so many Sheep's Head cult members gathered in this place. Obviously, the living sacrifice ceremony held in Hardland was to open the seal of the Holy Land of Atuk. This was not the first time such a situation had happened in Tokike. There had been several other ceremonies in the past, but they all failed without exception. But what surprised Brando was that according to the Sheep's Head cult members, the host of the ceremony, the Hajalai family, seemed to be particularly confident in this living sacrifice ceremony. Half a month ago, the Grey Scepter issued a summons to all the Sheep's Head cult members in the entire Tokike area and even the surrounding areas. Speaking of which, it was not the first time he had seen the cult's living sacrifice ceremony even in this world. He had seen such a large-scale ceremony once in the capital of the Cruz people, Rushta. At that time, the host was the Tree Herders, and the ceremony was quite successful. Not only did the Dragon Queen successfully summon the evil god Frederick, but she also almost used Frederick to kill the Will of Dusk. Recalling the various experiences in the elemental frontier, he could not help but be a little distracted. Fortunately, at this time, Delphian came down from upstairs. She seemed to have dealt with her personal problems. She came to Brando's side and cleverly took over the conversation. She talked to the owner of the inn, who was also a Sheep's Head cult member in a black robe, about the ritual and the Holy Land of Atuk. There were few common languages among the Sheep's Head cult members. The only common language they had in common was their beliefs, so Delphian's question did not attract any attention. Although the Prime Minister's daughter had never heard of the Holy Land of Atuk before, when she talked about this place, it was as if she had seen it with her own eyes and knew it well. The boss was convinced. Before the conversation, Delphine quickly got more information out of him. The three learned that the Holy Land of Atuk was not in the Tochik Swamp, but in the sea outside Hadland Port, in a sea called the Green Sea. This information immediately attracted Brando's attention. Before this trip, he had learned from Queen Madara that the stagnation realm might be in the central area of the Dead Moon Inner Sea, which was undoubtedly on the sea. The location of the stagnation realm was related to the mystery of the emerald. The sea, called the Green Sea, obviously provoked the nerves of the three people. Brando turned his head. Delphine's face was hidden under the hood, so he could not see her expression, but the Prime Minister's daughter was silent for a moment. She dipped her finger in the wine and quietly made a few numbers on the table. Brando saw that it was the result of a few calculations. The results were the angle of the sun. After discussing with Delphine every day for a month, he was already familiar with it. The location was obviously the Hadland Outer Sea. Brando immediately understood what the Prime Minister's daughter meant. Obviously, she also thought that the Holy Land of Atuk might be the place the mystery of the emerald pointed to, or at least it was related. Otherwise, how could there be so many secret places in this world? After the three of them exchanged opinions, Brando turned the topic back to the ruler of Hadland and the upcoming live sacrifice ceremony. In fact, in any other area of Wond, the topic of such a cult's live sacrifice ceremony would not be discussed. However, Tachik was obviously such a strange place. This was the true territory of the Sheep's Head cult. Here, beliefs other than the Dusk and the Devil were taboo. When Brando inadvertently asked the head of the Holduri family why he was so confident this time, the hotel owner had a strange look on his face. Brando was stunned for a moment, and then realized that this person might know something. This surprised him. He did not expect to get an answer to this question. Of course, the information that the person had could be unreliable, but it did not matter. At this time, the more information he had, the better. So, after Brando paid the extra money for the drinks, the hotel owner also let go of his mouth. He told the three of them with a mysterious look on his face that his cousin was living in the Hardlands and was deeply trusted by the city lord. Of course, Brendel believed that the owner of this rundown inn that looked like it was about to close down due to poor management was a trusted aide of the Hajalai family's head. The latter continued to tell them that his cousin had sent back a secret message that the Hajalai family had accidentally captured a dragon. A real dragon, not the kind of dragon that had the word dragon in its name but had little to do with the golden bloodline. Brando did not believe it at all. The dragons in this world were truly creatures that were second only to the gods. Even a young dragon like Alaz was extremely powerful, let alone a real adult dragon. Legendary dragons like Oenlos and Fuchsia were even more powerful to the extent that demigods would tremble before them. A mortal slaying a dragon? That was just a story in the legends. Although there were a few cases in history, the story's owner was not a legendary hero like the Azure Knight. Who was the head of the Holduri family? How could he be compared to those heroes in the legends? Not to mention, the Holduri family dared to use a dragon as a living sacrifice. Unless the followers of the Sheep's Head in the Tajik region were really tired of living, once this news spread, even if it was false, the dragons would probably raze this place to the ground because of the humiliation. But just when Brando thought that he had bought a meaningless fake news with money, there was suddenly a commotion in the hotel. Then he heard a curse from the direction of the hall. "Damn brat, ah!" The voice abruptly stopped. Then there was a scream and the sound of tables and chairs being flipped over. Brando subconsciously turned his head, thinking that his student had gotten into trouble again. He, Mr. Liu, and Delphine pushed their chairs away and stood up. The three of them held the hilts of their swords under their robes. But as soon as Brendel turned his head, he froze for a moment, because what he saw was not the phoenix's flames, but a scene that surprised him. Chapter 1359. Suddenly, a short figure stumbled out of the hall. She ran forward in a panic and repeatedly knocked away the Sheephead cult members in front of her. For a moment, the inn was filled with screams. Just behind the little girl, 7 or 8 Sheephead cult members were roaring and chasing from behind. The short figure's steps were too small, and she was quickly blocked by one of the Sheephead cult members. A sneer came from under the hood. "Damn little girl, let's see where you can run to." Brando couldn't help but frown slightly when he saw this. He had already seen that under the short black robe was actually a little girl. His gaze passed through the crowd and vaguely saw a person lying motionless on a wooden table. There was a faint dark red color spreading under her body. He vaguely understood what had happened. Hey, that little girl is really ruthless. Delphine turned her head and apparently saw this scene. Brando was silent and didn't make a rash conclusion. He only saw that the little girl's body trembled slightly after being stopped. Then she looked around. Her thin figure showed a little helplessness. But this helplessness quickly turned into determination. She suddenly turned around and rushed in another direction. Under the crowd's encirclement, she climbed up a wooden table with her hands and feet. She turned around and shouted. Then she pulled out a short sword from under the black robe. Her hands clenched the hilt of the sword. Her knuckles were faintly white because of excessive force. Her body was trembling because of fear, but she firmly pointed the tip of the sword at all the sheephead cult members surrounding her. The tip of the sword flickered with a cold light, forcing the sheephead disciples to fall off their horses. They hurriedly retreated and soon made a circle of space around the table. Brando heard clearly that the little girl's voice was crisp and pleasant. It was actually the tone of an elf or at least a half-elf. However, although the voice sounded fierce, the slight trembling of the voice clearly showed the fear and nervousness in the heart of the owner. "Do you want to help her?" Delphian looked back at him, her eyes moving. "Sir?" Brando shook his head. Although the little girl looked isolated and helpless, her attire was not much different from the sheepheads around her. She was also wearing a black robe and a large hood covered her face. Only her delicate chin was exposed, and her face was covered in dust and dirt. She stubbornly stood on the wooden table and faced everyone. Under her thin and weak shoulders, her thin arms under the robe tightly grasped the dagger. The dagger seemed to have been taken from its original owner. Its shape did not match this little girl. In her hand it looked like a long sword. She could only hold it tightly with both hands. However, at this moment, the dagger's blade was dyed with a dark red color. Droplets of blood continuously flowed down from the edge of the dagger, passing through the little girl's fair hands before dripping down bit by bit. "Damn it, she killed Buster. This damned little bitch." The sheephead cult members roared as if they were ready to attack at any time. Brando turned around at this time and asked the innkeeper on the side, "What's going on? It seems that this inn is not as safe as you promised." "Damn it," the innkeeper spat and cursed. He originally saw someone making trouble in his inn. He rolled up his sleeves and took out a crossbow from under the counter, but when he heard Brando's question he stopped. "That's Buster's slave. I warned him earlier. Damn it, he didn't listen to me at all." "What?" The innkeeper hesitated for a moment, thinking about whether to answer this question or not. Suddenly, his eyes were fixed on the movements of Brando's hands. He saw Brando take out more than 10 glittering black rose gold coins, Madara gold coins, minted 360 to 371, and line them up on the counter. The innkeeper seemed to have nails on his feet as he stopped abruptly. It was as if there was only this large amount of money left in his eyes. He even forgot to think about how these poor cult members had so much money. He greedily licked his lips and replied, "That little bitch is a living sacrifice brought by Buster. He said that she was a top-grade product caught in the swamp. She is a half-elf. However, I have never seen a half-elf with such sharp teeth and claws. Yesterday when Mago wanted to touch her, half of his hand was almost bitten off by that little bitch. To be honest, it's the first time I saw someone with such a tough bone, let alone a little girl. Buster and the others beat her half to death, but that little girl didn't even make a sound. I knew that little bitch was a dog that could bite people. Damn it, Buster didn't believe me at all. Now he lost his life." Brando understood the ins and outs of the matter, and his eyes immediately turned cold. Before the innkeeper could finish his words, he suddenly felt the temperature in his inn drop by several degrees. He shuddered and looked around strangely, thinking that he was hallucinating. At this time, flaming blade Odorfice had already appeared in Brando's hand. But in the next moment, the long sword with dark golden cracks flickered and turned into flames that scattered in the air. At this time, the sheephead cult member finally made a move on the half-elf girl. The little girl raised her head at this moment and clenched her teeth, revealing an exquisite face that shocked Brendel. He almost blurted out, "You're the one who saved me? Medisha?" But at this moment, the face that was almost exactly the same as the little silver elf princess, but obviously smaller, was full of despair. The little girl raised the dagger with both hands, and her first reaction was to commit suicide. However, Brando didn't panic at all, because at the critical moment, a crimson flame suddenly flashed in the dark inn. The flame swept across like a dragon, hitting all the sheephead cult members one by one. They screamed as they flew out, then an angry roar sounded: desert, wind, sword, technique, dragon, flame. The crimson dragon with flames coiled around it let out a long roar and exploded in all directions. The inn was in a mess again and again. The sheephead disciples screamed again and again, accompanied by the sound of tables and chairs being overturned, and the sound of wooden boards being broken could be heard. The next moment, Huang Hua's figure had appeared in front of the little girl. The little elf girl was obviously stunned by this scene and even forgot what she was doing. Her silver eyes reflected the golden red light of the fire, and in this light she saw a girl who was about the same height as her standing in front of her. Her back was facing her, and her clenched fists were burning with raging red flames. Under the light of the fire, her long black hair shone like a river of stars. Huang Hua obviously just came down from the second floor. She didn't even have time to put on her hood. A beautiful and delicate face suddenly appeared. But she was frowning. Obviously she was extremely angry about what happened just now. A group of cult members was so shameless to besiege a little girl. Such a scene almost made her attack immediately. Huang Hua was the princess of the Jade Phoenix bloodline. Although she usually showed modesty and politeness at this time, her majesty and momentum were natural. Not to mention the sheephead cult members who were taught a lesson by her. Even Brando was a little shocked. He thought that she was indeed the princess of the royal family. With this momentum alone, her future achievements were limitless. For a time, the only people who could still move in Token's boots were Brando and the others. The only one left was the swearing innkeeper. When Huang Hua attacked, the guy's eyes almost popped out. Seeing that his inn had suffered such a serious loss, the innkeeper was furious. He immediately raised his crossbow. But just as he had time to make a move, he felt a chill on his neck. A 3-foot-long sword had been placed on his neck. He suddenly shuddered. When he turned his head, he found that the guy in front of him, who had not spoken, had a sharp sword in his hand. And this sharp sword was now in some kind of intimate contact with his neck. The innkeeper shuddered, and his mind suddenly became clear. Only then did he remember that the 3 people in front of him seemed to have come to his inn with the little girl who attacked later. After understanding this, the innkeeper could only admit that he was unlucky and obediently threw the crossbow in his hand to the ground. Outsiders? They are not our people. There was a scream in the inn immediately. Obviously, the sheephead cult members were not fools. Soon they realized that there was a problem with the identity of Brando and the others. Immediately, some people pulled out their weapons and rushed over here. Some people were still summoning demons. The inn was suddenly in a mess. For these people, Brando would not be soft-hearted. He took them down with a snap of his fingers. But even so, there were still a few fish that escaped the net. They reacted quickly and rushed out of the inn. Especially a few who were originally at the door of the inn, Brando could not stop them in time. These people either fled or went out to call for help. In short, they were troublesome. Facing such a situation, Brando was also very helpless. He originally wanted to save the little half-elf Loli who looked like Medisha in a low-key manner. But with Huang Hua's attack, they had no choice but to be high-profile. But fortunately he shrugged. So be it if they were high-profile. Anyway, almost all the information he wanted had been obtained. He did not care about fighting here. With his strength, not to mention Amir Maltaha, even in the entire Takik region, there might not be anyone who could stop him. Besides, even if Huang Hua was not so high-profile when she attacked, he still had Mr. Lu who was eager to protect his master. The unlucky innkeeper actually dared to sneak attack Huang Hua. Presumably, Mr. Lu had tried his best to restrain himself. Otherwise, that sword would have directly opened a bloody wound on the innkeeper's neck. Chapter 1360. Brando frowned and stood up. He winked at Delphian and asked her to go upstairs to see how Princess Magadal was preparing. At the same time, he secretly gestured to Huang Hua, asking her to quickly bring the little girl over so that they could leave this place immediately. But what made Brando a little speechless was that he had asked the ladies to take care of their personal hygiene first, while he and Mr. Lu had not been able to rest for a moment. They had originally planned to stay in Martaha for the night, but now it seemed that they had to leave this place. After receiving his instructions, Huang Hua immediately turned and reached out her hand to the little girl, but when she turned around she was immediately taken aback, because she also found that the little girl looked like the silver fairy princess by her teacher's side. For Huang Hua's outstretched hand, the little girl hesitated for a moment, and silently shook her head, indicating that she did not need help. Huang Hua was a little surprised but still nodded. She herself was that kind of independent character, and she could understand the persistence of others. She gestured to the little girl, indicating that she should follow her, and then walked through the fallen sheep's head disciples to her teacher's side. To be honest, she was still a little uneasy, afraid that her teacher would blame her for acting without his consent. Because she knew that there was another mission on this trip, mainly to find the mystery of the emerald. After the previous rush of passion, she calmed down and was only left with bursts of worry, afraid that because of her impulse she would delay everyone's matters. But seeing that Brando did not mean to blame her, the princess of the Nine Phoenix Kingdom was a little relieved. Brando only looked at his student and said, "Next time before you act, at least make sure that what you are doing is right. Don't define good and bad on the surface." Huang Hua deeply agreed and said, "Teacher, I'm sorry, I know." Brando smiled and said, "Blood of the Inferno, soul of the Red Lotus, I'm afraid that it will be difficult for you to restrain your character of abhorrence in this life. The talent of fate is not only a talent for you but also your heart. In fact, my worries are unnecessary. As long as you don't go against your heart, you will naturally reach my height in the future and maybe even surpass me. It seems like your current fighting style is more in line with your martial path. If there's a chance, I'll give you something." Wang Hua looked confused. She didn't understand what her teacher meant. However, she understood what her teacher meant. Her eyes brightened. She was intelligent and naturally understood the meaning behind Brando's words. He wanted to give her a handy weapon. A weapon that was more in line with her martial arts heart. Then Brando looked at the little girl who came with Huang Hua. She still had her guard up against them. She didn't take off her hood. When she met his gaze, she just lowered her head quietly and accepted his scrutiny. It could be seen that this little girl still had some unique rejection and indifference towards him, probably because of his previous words that vaguely suspected her identity. However, Brando knew that he was merely teaching Huang Hua a lesson for his student and wasn't targeting her at all. However, he didn't need to care about the little girl's attitude. He carefully sized up the lower half of her face that was exposed outside the hood. The more he looked, the more he could see the charm of Medisha. She was just like a mini Medisha. Besides, through some details, he also determined that she was a half-elf. He vaguely had a guess about her identity, but he didn't voice it out. Instead, he asked in a gentle tone, "What's your name?" The little girl lifted her head and glanced at him. Her silver eyes were full of indifference. There weren't many superfluous expressions on her face. She just stared back at him indifferently. But he could still see the long silver hair hidden under the hood and the sharp ears behind it. "It's not safe for you to stay here." Brando looked up. The rest of the people in the inn were obviously shocked by his previous attack and didn't dare to act rashly. They stayed where they were and looked at them with vigilance. After sweeping a glance at them, he lowered his head and said to the little girl, "We're leaving Marta soon. Do you want to come with us?" The little girl nodded. However, she immediately stretched out her hand and made a gesture. Brando actually understood it. She was saying, "Wait for a moment." He nodded. The little girl immediately turned around and ran into the depths of the hall. Brando saw her run to the corpse and stopped. She squatted down and untied a belt from the corpse. Then she put it on herself and wiped her sword on the corpse. She sheathed the sword and hung it on the belt. Then she searched the corpse for a moment and took out a money bag before running back to them. That incomparably huge short sword hung on her waist, causing the little girl to stumble as she ran. It was truly extremely strange. Wang Hua was almost stunned. As a princess who was born with a golden spoon in her mouth, she never thought that someone would rob a corpse like this. She never dreamed that the elven girl she saved would do such a thing. However, Brando saw a pair of bare feet under the little girl's robe when she ran. The white soles of her feet were blue and purple from the cold. They were covered with solidified and dried mud and blood clots. He didn't know how long she had been trekking in the swamp. For a moment he couldn't help but feel compassion in his heart. However, compassion aside, it was obviously not the time to talk. This town was full of sheephead cult members. If he really called for reinforcements, although he was not afraid with his strength, he did not want to cause too much trouble. After all, even if he took action and uprooted all of Tao Chica's sheephead cult members, not to mention whether he could do it or not, even if he could, he did not know how much time he would have to waste. This was obviously inconsistent with his original intention. He looked up and saw Delphine and Princess Magadol walking down from the second floor. They immediately left the inn called Token's Boots. Before they left, Mr. Liu used a karate chop to knock out the owner of the inn who claimed to be his cousin who was the confidant of the Lord of Hardlands. Walking out of the inn, Princess Magadol also noticed the fact that the half-elf girl was walking barefoot in the cold mud. She couldn't help but want to carry her, but the latter was obviously very alert. When the nun princess approached, she showed a vigilant look and took a step back. Brando saw this and shook his head. With a flick of his finger, he cast a second circle wind element spell, Wind Wings, on the little girl. The little girl was slightly surprised and found that she was floating. She silently looked at Brando and didn't say thank you. She just lowered her head and continued to walk forward. Magadol looked at Brando gratefully. Before the group of people walked out of the town, they were blocked by the followers who escaped from the Token's Boots. There were a lot of people, about 30 to 40 of them. The leader of the group claimed to be the sheriff of Marta. However, Brando had already learned some information about this place from the owner of the inn. He knew that this person was a small leader of the followers in Marta. Originally, this person didn't come looking for trouble, and he didn't have the time to clean up the cancer here. After all, after the defeat of Cruz, the situation in the north of Erewhon was unclear. There was also a conflict between the old and new royal factions. Although Freya brought back his will, he wasn't too sure if she and the princess could deal with the entrenched traditional nobles. Coupled with the matter of the Roman, the most urgent thing in his heart now was to return to Erewhon and begin to prepare to rescue the merchant lady. This time, if it wasn't for the mystery of the emerald and the whereabouts of the nature orb, which was related to the 7 holy swords and the rescue of the Roman, he wouldn't have come here to waste his time no matter what the Queen of Madara said. However, since these people were here, Brando naturally wouldn't be polite. With his current strength, he was almost invincible in the mortal world. Other than the most powerful people, such as the great sage Vara and several hidden masters of the various empires, perhaps only the best of the silver and gold races could suppress him. However, that was merely suppression. Before the guy who claimed to be the sheriff of Maltaha could finish his words, Brando was too lazy to listen to his nonsense. A golden red light flashed in his hand, and the holy sword of fire, Odorfice, appeared in his hand. One move. What? Brando raised his left hand, and more than 40 sheep-head disciples were horrified to find that they immediately lost control of their bodies, and then involuntarily flew into the air. Then he waved the sword in his right hand into the air, and a golden red line extended half the length of the town, sweeping towards the sheep-head disciples in the air. Supreme Realm. The sheriff of Maltaha screamed, and the shock and fear on his face was as if he had seen the end of the world. But before he could shout half a sentence from his throat, he had been completely turned into ashes with his whole body. And with him there were more than 40 sheep-head disciples who were with him. Mr. Liu and the 3 ladies who were with Brando had long been accustomed to this scene. Huang Huo was even more convinced of her teacher's strength. Seeing such a scene, she only strengthened her determination to reach such a level of strength one day. But for the only outsider, the half-elf girl had long been scared stiff. So much so that Princess Magadol called her 2 or 3 times, but the little girl still hadn't recovered from the previous shock. After that, Brando clearly felt that the other party intentionally or unintentionally kept a distance from him, and from time to time her eyes were filled with deep vigilance. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. He didn't expect that he would inadvertently scare the little girl when he wanted to solve the problem simply. However, although the little half-elf girl showed maturity that didn't match her age in all aspects, but in some aspects she was naive and cute. She didn't think about it even if she was far away. If he really wanted to do something to her, how could she escape? But Brando didn't correct the little half-elf girl's deep-rooted self-view, and only took her to the place south of Maltaha where he had agreed with Fang Qi. As they left the town much earlier than the scheduled time, they didn't know if the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan had already arrived there. But in the current situation, it seemed that camping in the wild for the night was inevitable. Brando couldn't help but secretly frown at this thought. Camping in the wetland swamp was not a fun thing to do, especially when they were unprepared. Chapter 1361. Night always fell early before winter. Brando and the others traveled south of Maltaha for 3 or 4 hours before the sky darkened. Winter nights in Takaik were particularly damp and cold. Although the inland sea area of the Dead Moon did not freeze at night, the ground would become cold and hard. The swamp was filled with fog, there was almost no wind, and there were very few sounds of insects. It was so quiet that it was almost eerie. Occasionally there would be the sound of water splashing in the darkness. The bonfire was burning and 1 or 2 sparks would occasionally jump out. The bright yellow light penetrated the fog and could shine far away, but it would also cause unnecessary trouble. In addition to the beasts and ghouls in the swamp, there were also swarms of mosquitoes. Even at this time of year, there were still a large number of mosquitoes in the Takaik area. The mosquitoes followed the light, and even if they had already prepared insect repellents, it was not very useful. Brando drove the mosquitoes away with his hands, and from time to time used the power of law. Delphine dried fish and mushrooms by the bonfire. These ingredients were all sourced from the local area. The Prime Minister's daughter's culinary skills were unexpectedly good. Everyone present more or less tasted a little, and they all expressed their praise. As a princess, Huang Hua only took a symbolic bite. Her diet was strict, and she maintained the same self-discipline when she went out. However, she suggested that they prepare more in case of emergencies. After all, when they thought of the strange diet of the sheephead cult in Maltaha, everyone agreed. The crimson moon Moya had risen from the horizon in the west, but Fang Qi still had not appeared. It seemed that he would not show up until the appointed time. Delphian took a smoked fish from the grill, then handed it to Brando and pointed her chin in a direction in the darkness. Brando understood what she meant, but he was a little surprised and looked at her. What? Who do you think this vicious woman is scheming against? The Prime Minister's daughter smiled and asked in a joking tone. Is that little girl worth your scheming against? Brando was not polite at all to the Prime Minister's daughter. Although the two had been intimate, what happened on the ship that day had left a barrier in Brando's heart. To be exact, there was no love between him and Delphian, only desire. Since then, because he deliberately kept a distance, even the relationship between the two had weakened a lot. Brando did not know what Delphian thought of this matter. Perhaps she did not care at all, but he cared very much. Every time he faced the Prime Minister's daughter, he felt very awkward. His straightforwardness was also to cover up the awkwardness. Delphian smiled slightly as if she did not care. She handed over the wooden skewer in her hand and said, "She hasn't eaten anything since coming here from town." "Delphian," Brando suddenly said, "the crew's empire is currently in an unknown state. We don't even know if your father and grandfather are still alive. I'll tell you the truth, I can't see what the future will be like in the war with the Twilight Dragon. All I can do is protect Erwin and the people around me, and fulfill the promise I made to the Queen of Madara. You should have already seen that I can't give you too much of a guarantee. I can't even become the king of the Wand and rebuild the empire." There was a campfire between the two of them. Mr. Liu was on guard outside the camp. Phoenix Flame had already gone to rest in her tent, and Magadol needed to practice meditation and communicate with her magic. For a moment there were only the two of them talking in the camp. "And then what do you want to say?" "I want to say that you don't have to be like this," Brando sighed. "You know what kind of person I am. If you want something you can tell me as much as you can. Although you have caused me a lot of trouble in the past, Medisha and I have seen your efforts in the past 2 months. Let's leave the grudges between us in the past. If you are willing to let bygones be bygones, I can help you like a friend. What I mean is, I will do my best within the scope of my abilities. What you mean is that I don't have to bind myself to you and force myself to smile in front of you every day. I should pursue the path I want, right?" "That's not what I mean, Delphian." "No, my lord, that's what you mean. I know you're pitying me," Delphine replied with a smile. "Does my lord think that it's too tiring to play this game of cat and mouse with me, and you don't want to continue? All right, I admit that you are right. But Delphian, the grudge between us originated from a misunderstanding. I have said before that I will not apologize to you for your fiancé's death because it has nothing to do with me. But I can apologize for the damage that I have caused you. Perhaps if we had both taken a step back in ABs, things would not have turned out this way." "What about Miss Roman? You don't hate me for what I did to Miss Roman?" Delphian asked softly. "You don't have to provoke me. Because of what happened to Miss Roman, I wanted to kill you and give you an unforgettable lesson. But after that, too many things happened that I did not expect." Brando shook his head. "To be honest, I don't know how to face you. On one hand you are my enemy, Miss Delphian. On the other hand I have hurt you. Do you really think that you have hurt me?" Brando nodded without hesitation. "You are a righteous but naive person," Delphian replied. "But you still don't understand what kind of path you want me to pursue? Leaving you and returning to the scheming and deceit of the past, is that the kind of life you think I should live?" She shook her head. "Why do you think that I am forcing myself to smile? In fact, these days have been the most relaxing and truest days of my life. When we return to the Empire, I don't know what kind of choice I will make. But at least here I feel real and happy." Brando was stunned. The Prime Minister's daughter suddenly sighed quietly. She put the smoked fish back on the grill and stood up. She took out a blanket from her backpack, walked over, and handed it to Brando. Brando was slightly stunned when he saw the blanket. He remembered that he had covered the Prime Minister's daughter with this blanket in the north of Rosaline. At that time he thought that she had fallen asleep, but he did not expect that she was only pretending to be asleep. He looked at the blanket in his hand. Delphian had taken good care of it. Even in the swamp environment, the blanket was very dry and tidy. It was also very neatly folded, and every edge was carefully aligned. "I'm sorry. It is time for me to wake up from my unrealistic dream. In the long dream in the elemental frontier, the terrible things I saw made me weak." Delphine replied faintly, "These days I've given up on myself. That's why such a ridiculous thing happened. I've let my fiancé down and I've also let my lord down. I thought that mistakes would disappear with time, but I was wrong. I'm still me. Running away can't change reality, Miss Delphian. Delphian shook her head. Sir, you do not need to persuade me. You are right. When I return to Erewhon, I will find my own path. You and Miss Medusa are both righteous people, but this place doesn't belong to me. I shouldn't impose my own ideas on others. Although I used all kinds of despicable means to force you to agree, it's a pity that if it's not your true intention, it's meaningless in the end. I, Delphine, Nydiven's daughter, don't need to rely on others' charity to succeed. Delphian put down her luggage and picked up the smoked fish from the grill. At the same time she replied, Sir, thank you for not pursuing my mistakes. I will do my best to help you get the nature's pearl. This is the last time I will help you by your side because this is my apology. I must make up for my mistakes, but I know very well that this is far from enough. If Sir still wants my life, I definitely won't mind. She pointed to her snow-white neck and replied, My head is right here, ready for Sir at any time. Miss Delphian, you know that is not what I mean. The Prime Minister's daughter smiled bitterly. Are you saying that you want to trample on the last bit of dignity I have as the eldest daughter of the Nydiven family? Brando could only keep his mouth shut. He looked at the noble's daughter and felt a little emotional. Perhaps she was showing her true feelings, but he still did not dare to fully believe it, because it could also be another one of her tricks. But even if he knew that this could be an act, when Delphian said those words, he still felt a sense of loss in his heart. However, Delphian did not explain. She placed the grilled fish in his hand and said, Even the most willful and scheming woman has a heart of compassion. She has not eaten a drop of water since noon. Her pouch is full of stones. Stones? Brando was shocked. That is a girl with a backbone. You will not understand her, but I do. Because I see my past self in her, Delphian replied softly. But I am much happier than her. At least I still have family. You are wrong about one thing, Miss Delphian, Brando replied in a low voice. She also has family. I think she has at least one elder sister or younger sister. Their mother should still be alive. Perhaps she is still alive. You know her? Delphian suddenly showed an expression of understanding. She is related to Miss Medusa? Brando nodded. He had already seen this Prime Minister's daughter's mind, so he was not surprised by her reaction. However, he did not continue to explain because he could not be completely sure of his guess about her identity. Chapter 1362. He looked back into the darkness. Far away from the camp, there was another bonfire that shone like a star. That bonfire was so weak that it seemed like it would go out at any time. There seemed to be a lonely and thin figure beside the bonfire. Seeing this, Brando could not help but sigh in his heart. It was not that he did not want the half-elf girl to camp with them, but her vigilance was beyond his imagination. He did not know what kind of experience she had to go through to have such a personality, but she was unwilling to come close to their camp. She was only willing to set up a separate camp a few dozen meters away from their camp. She refused their help. Although it was a little strenuous, whether it was the small bonfire or the simple tent, she had done it alone. Only when Phoenix Fire gave her the canvas and wood to set up the tent did the little elf girl say, "Thank you." But it seemed that she did not realize that the so-called extra wood and canvas were actually taken down by Brando directly from an intact tent. When they started the fire, Brando noticed that the half-elf girl was setting up the tent alone. When night fell, when they were roasting fish, she was still setting up the tent. Now that the lonely figure finally stopped, it seemed that the camp had been set up. Brendel passed through the darkness between the two camps and arrived at the bonfire. This was the scene he saw when he arrived at the bonfire. The bonfire was in a wind stove surrounded by a few stones. There were a few remaining flames in the embers of the dead branches. The half-elf girl was still wearing her tattered sheep's head disciple's robe that was obviously one size too big. Her legs were curled together, one hand was wrapped around her calf, and the other hand was holding 2 or 3 dead branches. She put her head on her knees and seemed to be shivering. Brando understood at a glance. She did not find much firewood. In order to ensure that the bonfire would not go out, she could only maintain such a weak flame. But this little flame was not enough to keep warm in the middle of the night in Tokike. "Why don't you enter the tent?" Brando stood in the darkness for a moment and suddenly asked. The half-elf girl did not notice Brando's approach at all. She was so scared that she jumped up from the ground like a cat. But because she was frozen, she could not stand up and sat on the ground. But even so, Brando saw that her hands were on the hilt of the short sword. "I really don't know what kind of life this poor little girl has been living." He could not help but feel pity for her. When he approached her camp, he suddenly realized that the tent she had built was just for show. She did not have any nails or ropes to secure the canvas or the wooden frame. I should have thought of this earlier, but she did not mention it. I thought that since she has been trekking in this swamp for such a long time, she must have something that she can use. Brendel was a little annoyed. I should have thought of this earlier, but she did not mention it. Since she has been trekking in this swamp for such a long time, she must have some corresponding items. He did not expect that he was still lacking. It's not good to be so stubborn. He could not help but frown and said in a deep voice, "Why didn't you tell us?" The other party did not answer. She only held the hilt of the sword tightly. A pair of cold silver eyes stared at him vigilantly from under the hood. She was as sensitive as a cat guarding its territory. She was just a kitten that did not have the ability to protect itself. Brando sighed and did not wait for the little girl to answer. He walked over and set up her tent again. Then he took out a rope from his bag and helped her to fix it. Then he pulled the canvas and fixed it to the ground with nails. The little elf girl did not speak and only coldly looked at his every move. Brando noticed that her body was very tense. It was as if he made the slightest move, she would not hesitate to pull out her sword. Although it might not be to attack him. She knew that she was no match for Brendel, but she did not think that she was a match for him. However, Brando was afraid that she would hurt herself. He looked at her feet that were wrapped with bandages. Originally, Huang Ho wanted to lend her boots, but she insisted on not accepting. She only wanted some bandages. The bandages were not wrapped well enough. Even her toes were exposed. Noticing Brando's gaze, the little elf girl subconsciously shrank her feet. For the first time, Brando saw a look of inferiority on her face. "Where is your sister?" The little girl suddenly trembled and looked at him with an expression of disbelief. However, this expression was quickly replaced by a more serious look of vigilance. She still kept her mouth shut and did not say a word. If he had not heard her say, "Thank you," to Huang Hua, Brando would have thought that she did not know how to speak and was a mute. "It seems that you are indeed the elder sister." Brando nodded. "Did you come here for your sister?" There was still no answer. "You don't have to worry too much. You should be able to see that if we are on the same side as those people, you won't be able to escape, right?" "Thank you." What? Brando was stunned. Even with his perception, he could not hear the little girl's voice clearly. "Thank you, you." The voice was a little louder, but it was very choppy. It was as if the owner of the voice rarely communicated with others and did not know how to speak. This time Brando heard it clearly. He looked at the little girl who was wearing a wrinkled robe. Her expression was vigilant and somewhat restrained. He felt very sorry for her. "Is there anything we can help with?" he asked softly. The little girl shook her head. "Even if it's about your sister?" The little girl hesitated for a moment, but still shook her head firmly. Brando suddenly understood. He looked at the little girl carefully and silently put away the sympathy in his heart. He was silent for a moment and suddenly asked, "My name is Brando. What's your name?" Ling Teredi Tiamas," the voice said in a small and weak voice. When Brando returned to the campfire in the camp, the Prime Minister's daughter had already recovered her smiling expression. She saw Brando return empty-handed. Her purple eyes flashed with a smile again. "How was it?" "Don't scheme against the little girl." Brando looked at her in annoyance. He knew that the Prime Minister's daughter was deliberately making fun of him. "I put some food in her tent. She will see it. Why don't you give it to her in person? She doesn't have much, but it is very precious. We can't take away that little thing." Brando took a breath and replied. "She is a very cute little girl, right?" Brando looked at her in annoyance. Delphian did not care and only made a gesture to invite him to sit next to her. Brando was stunned for a moment. Then he saw that Delphian had already spread out the blanket that she gave him earlier. Brando hesitated for a moment, but for some reason he sat down. He felt Delphian's head leaning towards him. The faint fragrance of the young girl's hair lingered at the tip of his nose. After a moment before he could speak, the young girl had already said, "Are you beginning to doubt the truth of what I said earlier, my lord?" "A little. Don't worry, what I said is true. But at least for now, let me dream for a while, okay?" Delphian replied faintly, "Because I am also very tired, my lord." Brando opened his mouth as if he wanted to persuade her, but when the words came out, he could not say it. Reviving the Nidwin family was Delphian's obsession, and how could he not be the same? If it was not because of this obsession, how could he come here to this world called Wond? Because of this, his two souls merged into one. How could he know so many people and experience so many things? He raised his head, and his gaze followed the rising sparks of the bonfire to the sky. In the hazy night, there seemed to be starlight shining through the fog. The crimson moon Moya hung above the starry sky. It was like described in myths and legends, where the gods used the eyes of the stars to watch this land. That was the fate and pulse of this world. It was connecting everyone together. The crimson moon Moya. Grand Duke Stick turned around from the balcony. Above the surface of the sublime inland sea, which had never changed for thousands of years, a bright moon hung in the sky. The mast stood tall in the dark harbor, but it was silent. Only the sound of the waves could be heard from afar. Father Ferguson, I'm thinking about a question. I wonder if the moonlight we see today also comes from the magnificent era 1,000 years ago. Perhaps there isn't much difference between what the two generations have seen? You are too sentimental, my lord. It is hard not to be sentimental. Time flies and countless things in the mortal world have decayed and changed, but some things have always been unique. It is really enviable. Even if we know that behind this full moon is our great enemy, I still want to see this moonlight as long as I am alive. I want to see the beautiful scenery of the sublime inland sea in our beautiful world. Perhaps this is the so-called trouble of mortals. Because they are too short, they are attached to eternal beauty. That is because we love this land deeply. We call the land under our feet our homeland. It is the land that gave birth to us. Since I was a child, I have been familiar with everything in this city. I have witnessed the prosperity and development of Cloak Bay. I once left this place to make a name for myself. But after leaving the post of Scepter Bishop, I came back here in my old age because this land gave me life. At the moment of my death, I want to return all of its gifts to the cradle and home that it gave me. Unfortunately, Lady Martha is destined to play a joke on us two old men, Grand Duke Stick said with a smile. After all, only one of us can rest here in peace, and the other will leave this place alive. Perhaps after a long, long time, the people of this land will not be able to return to their homeland. But we already have the answer, don't we? Thank you, my old friend. The Grand Duke looked deeply at the other party. Actually, I really envy you. Just like you, I also grew up in this land. These days, the memories that I should have forgotten long ago became clearer and clearer. I suddenly remembered everything that happened under the city walls, on that street, in that forest. I remembered my grandmother who had passed away a long time ago, the mill that was demolished before the 6 Days' War, and a certain depression outside the city. Oh my God, I never thought that I had walked through so many days here. From my youth to the prime of my life, from the prime of my life to the middle of my life, and then to old age. The Grand Duke's eyes were a little moist. Only when I lose them do they seem to be very precious. So, I am lucky. The priest smiled faintly. But you must take our hope away from here. I will rest in the present, and you promised me that you will bring the future back here. The Grand Duke nodded and patted the priest's shoulder. This was undoubtedly a rude gesture, but at that moment no one cared. Let's go, he said. Let's go and meet our guests, the blessed of wisdom. We used to be enemies, but now we have to sit together and make a decision for our common future. Things are unpredictable, my friend. Yes, things are unpredictable. Chapter 1363. In the center of the Cloak Bay area, Dorbian. The port was built against the mountain, and the gray city wall divided the city into 3 areas from top to bottom. Because most of the building materials were granite and limestone, which were abundant in the nearby mountains, the city showed an overall grayish-black color. The square, the streets, the bungalows and the churches were all monochromatic like a thick black print. The city was bustling with people. The black stream of people was slowly moving towards the south and southeast gates of Duo-Bien City. Some of the people had already left the city and appeared on the plains south of Duo-Bien City. The people were carrying beasts, carriages and horses of all sizes. It was a scene of people fleeing for their lives. Although there was a negotiation going on in the city hall, in any case the migration of Cloak Bay was inevitable. The nobles had yet to announce the news, but the lower-class civilians were extremely sensitive to the atmosphere of war. They had long smelled the scent of a storm. Under the dome of the Dorbian City Hall, the negotiations between the two sides had been going on for a whole night. Early morning had arrived in the coastal area. Above the gloomy sea, 3 or 4 sail frigates were floating alone in the distant sky. In the hall, the dispute was getting fiercer and fiercer. Father Demond had almost agreed to all the requests of the Hazel people, including a temporary alliance, making the fleet obey the unified command of the Hazel people, and even the evacuation plan must be included in the other party's overall plan. Correspondingly, The only price that the Hazel people had to pay was that they must join the military alliance with Cloak Bay. You didn't read it wrong. It was a military alliance between Cloak Bay and the Hazel people. Cloak Bay could not represent the entire empire. In the absence of contact with the capital, this was their only way to save themselves. But the focus of the dispute between the two sides was around the core issue of whether to stick to Dorbian. Your Excellency, although the hatred between the Cruz people and the Hazel people has lasted for centuries, today, we are also sitting down to negotiate because we are of the same origin. We are all members of the intelligent creatures. Perhaps after thousands of years, the empire will turn into ashes, and the Hazel people will naturally not be able to escape the trial of time. But our wisdom, history, and the culture we created will still be passed down by future generations after the empire perishes. Father Damon's voice echoed under the dome of the city hall, sounding impassioned. Whether it is the civilization of the Cruz people or the civilization of the Hazel people, they all belong to our world. Whether you and I want to admit it or not, even in the past hundreds of years, our two countries are still deeply influenced by each other. Your magical technology, our art and culture, we learn from each other's strengths. The boundaries of the countries will gradually blur with the passage of time. Perhaps everything that the Cruz people today will become the precious heritage of the Hazel people tomorrow, and vice versa. Dorbian City has a long history. It has been built since the beginning of the Chaos Era. It has a history of 700 years. 700 years ago, a group of merchants came here and built a simple wall to make it convenient for them to store their goods. Later, the city rose from the ground and became the center of Cloak Bay. It is one of the oldest cities in Cruz and the cradle of the Imperial Navy. Every inch of its land has countless legends and stories. The city also has the famous Dorbian Cathedral, which is the treasure of the Cruz people and the entire human world. It is the highest masterpiece of architectural art. These may belong to the Cruz people today, but tomorrow they will belong to the entire civilized world. If we abandon them easily today, will we abandon everything we have tomorrow? I'm not afraid of death, but I just want to say, Your Excellency, there are some things in this world that are worth protecting with one's life. All eyes in the hall were focused on the priest who was once the scepter bishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Cruz people were proud of these words. But no matter how proud they were, there were very few people who were willing to stay and sacrifice themselves for these words. As soon as the priest's voice fell, there was a buzz of discussion in the hall. Damon frowned deeply. He knew that his words could not even convince the nobles of the Cruz people, let alone the Hazel people. He could only hope that the prophet was a real wise master, not these short-sighted nobles who stayed to see the attitude of the Hazel people. The negotiators of the Hazel Envoy group were two people, the frontline commander in charge of the attack on Fort Cetos and his spiritual mentor, the prophet Salma. The prophets of the Hazel people were similar to the bishops and priests of the Cruz people, but they had more power. These prophets often also served as spiritual mentors of military commanders. They were only responsible to His Majesty the King and the Great Prophet. This sounded ridiculous, but the Hazel people were a kingdom sheltered by the dragon crystal of wisdom. Their prophets were often wise and knowledgeable people who were indifferent to fame and fortune. Their tradition had never made any mistakes in history. Instead, it made their enemies feel invulnerable and anxious. When Demond was a scepter bishop, he followed the army to the empire's front line to inspect the Azure Legion. At that time, he wished that the prophet of the Hazel people was a muddle-headed fool. But now he hoped that the prophet Salma was a truly respected and wise person. Between the two, the frontline commander of the Hazel people did not agree with his opinion. Even if the other party was willing to stay and defend, it was also out of consideration for the evacuation of time, not really to protect the city. According to the Hazel people, they should not give up the precious lives of more people for the sake of a city, especially those elite warriors. They would be the precious strength of both the Hazel people and the Cruz people in the future. Not only were they unwilling to stay and defend Dabian, but they also asked the Cruz people to evacuate the current defense, leaving only the necessary defensive forces that could delay the advance of the Crystal Cluster army. Not only could Damon not accept such a suggestion, but the nobles of Cruz behind him also could not agree. But this did not mean that these nobles had deep feelings for the city. What they cared about was the attitude of the Hazel people. As Father Damon said, if the Hazel people despised their history and traditions, and even hated the city for historical reasons because the Cruz Navy had severely damaged the Hazel fleet several times. In the same situation, the Cruz people would certainly not be willing to set up a monument for the Hazel Navy. But such an attitude made the Cruz people feel insecure because if they had to put their fate in the hands of the Hazel people, then they at least had to first feel the sincerity of the Hazel people. The nobles' opinions were simple and clear, because it was closely related to their own safety. But for Father Demond he considered far more than that. He also wanted to see the attitude of the Hazel people, but this attitude was not only for the Cruz people. Because he was very clear about the enemy they were facing, in front of such an enemy, it was far from enough to just protect their lives. The two sides argued over such issues and time passed by minute by minute. After Father Demond finished his speech, he sat back and did not speak again. He knew that this was not a choice for either the Cruz people or the Hazel people. For both sides they had to make this choice. Otherwise, the next great migration would only be empty words written on paper. Either perish together or trust each other. At this moment, for two opponents with centuries of hatred, it was a bit difficult to choose. And for the other side of the negotiation table, the Hazel people also felt the urgency of time. 2 months ago, or to be exact, 3 months ago, since the arrival of the fire of heaven, the Cruz people found that their old rival Cruz people suddenly disappeared on the Western Front. Several intelligence personnel who escaped from Russia described the events that happened in the Cruz Empire that day. The Great Prophet and the astrologers of the Tower of Stars and Moon predicted that the Great Prophecy had come according to the fall of the Black Moon. The Hazel people must follow the prophecy and leave their homeland with the fire of wisdom. They must go to the south and be led by a great man to find hope. But the Shirima, the king of iron, turned a deaf ear to the prophecy and the advice of the Great Prophet. Instead, he thought that this was an opportunity to completely end the hatred of hundreds of years. It was time to give a fatal blow to the Cruz people. Before that, they only needed to defeat the army of crystal monsters wandering around the border of the empire. The Shirima gathered the most powerful army of the Hazel people and went to the north of the Summerhill Mountains to fight the Twilight's minions in the foothills of the mountains. The war lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, and the final result was that hundreds of thousands of troops were annihilated. The Shirima himself and his eldest son were also defeated and killed. The elite forces that the Hazel Empire had prepared for decades for the decisive battle with the Cruz people were all gone. When the bad news reached the kingdom, Sharma's second son was appointed to succeed the throne. After unifying the opinions of the elders, the young prince decided to follow the arrangements of the Great Prophet and leave the homeland with the people to find the hope described in the prophecy. But when the Hazel people went south, they first had to face their old rival, the Cruz people. The Cedos fortress under the Cloak Bay had never fallen for hundreds of years. The King of Iron, the Shirima, had tried to attack it more than once but never succeeded. Chapter 1364. Even the bravest monarch of the Hazel people couldn't cross the walls of Cedos fortress, let alone the Hazel people now. The threat from the north was approaching day by day, and Cedos fortress had become an unavoidable problem for the Hazel people. No matter how many people died under this fortress, it would not solve their current problem. They could not afford to wait for this negotiation either. The hall fell into silence. The frontline commander of the Hazel people was about to speak, but an old man behind him patted him on the shoulder and stood up. Prophet Salma. He had once served as the guardian of the Crystal Temple, and was one of the 3 candidates for the position of Great Prophet. His status was equivalent to the scepter bishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so in this negotiation he was the one who made the final decision among the Hazel people. "Sir, you are right," Salma said in an old voice, but he sounded more like he was talking to the commander beside him. "In a choice that both sides have to make, it is impossible for us to not pay anything. Justice is also the greatest wisdom." "Lord Salma?" Salma turned his head, looked directly into Demond's eyes and slowly replied, "This city is the precious treasure of the civilized world. If the Cruz people have the determination to protect it, then the Hazel people will not lack this wisdom and courage. But," he slowly changed his tone and said, "we must understand what is it that we are protecting." Father Demond did not say a word, because he understood that there was no need for him to answer here. "Sure enough," Prophet Salma continued, "it's not just this city represents our civilization and history, it represents the memories and inheritance of the Kurlutz people, and it will also be a part of our entire civilized world. We will dedicate and sacrifice for these precious things, to protect them at all costs, but not just here." A light flashed in the depths of Father Demond's eyes, and then he said, "What does Lord Prophet say? I see that your close friend Duke Diomedes has left the city hall. You have decades of tacit understanding with him, so you will stay and live and die with this city, right?" Father Demond nodded. He didn't try to hide this fact. Even if Dorbian had to move, someone had to stay behind to cover the retreat for the refugees. This person could only be either Father Demande or Diomedes. Fate had chosen Father Demande. Although the nobles in the hall had already expected this, when Demande confirmed it, they could not help but discuss again. The hall was a little noisy, but Prophet Salma's voice seemed to be able to drown out everyone's voices. The old man quietly replied, "There is a contract that has been covered in dust for thousands of years. If courage and sacrifice is needed today to reawaken its weight in our hearts, then I am willing to sign my name on it." He looked up at Father Desmond and said, "Our descendants will remember today, remember that there was a moment when someone shed blood and sacrificed himself to protect the most precious things in the world. I think that with such a spirit being passed down, Father should be satisfied, right?" Father Demande slowly nodded his head. As he moved by his action Demande by Demande Salma nodded his head. "I heard that it's a candidate for the position of the great prophet. Lord Salma is also the most favored successor of the great prophet. You are equivalent to the scepter bishop among us, and the one most likely to inherit the great sanctum, right?" There was a gasp in the hall, and the nobles all looked at Prophet Salma in surprise. Obviously they did not expect him to have such a high status. Just because of this identity many people were relieved. Since the Hazel people had sent someone with such an important status to negotiate, it was enough to show their sincerity. But Prophet Salma only replied, "Father Demande, weren't you also a scepter bishop?" "That was in the past," Father Demande replied. "Besides, I have no hope of inheriting the position of the Great Holy See. Your status is far from comparable to mine." He listened for a moment, then continued, "Are you really willing to stay and live and die with this city?" As soon as these words came out, there was a dead silence in the city hall. Most of the nobles then reacted to what the prophet of the Hazel people had said earlier. Most of them could not help but look at Salma in disbelief. Although Father Demande had made an exception first, as the latter said, the difference in status between the two could not be measured by the Tao. "Life is precious, but it is not unworthy of sacrifice," Father Salma said with a smile. Almost every generation of Hazel kings died on the battlefield, and the eldest son of the king was often the same. Although they clearly had supreme power and the possibility of taking over the crown, they all chose courage in the face of death without exception. Because courage is the greatest wisdom. The crystal tells us that only with wisdom can we be brave. Otherwise it is pointless recklessness. I choose this answer here because I understand that our choice is meaningful. He looked at Father Demande and replied, "In fact, even if the Cruz people did not make such a choice, I would have let the Hazel people do so. But I am happy to see that among the Cruz people, there is also such a far-sighted wise man. This shows that the hatred between the Cruz people and the Hazel people is not unresolvable. We have a lot in common. Perhaps in the disaster of the battlefield, we will learn to be tolerant and forgiving." Father Demande, "At this moment, I am not acting as a prophet of the Hazel people, but as a friend of the Cruz people, as a friend of everyone here, breathing with this city and facing its ultimate fate." Prophet Salma said loudly, "I would like to ask everyone, do you still remember the covenant between the Hazel people and the Cruz people 1,000 years ago?" The nobles looked at each other for a moment, feeling ashamed in their hearts. They, the children of Dabian, the masters of this city, in front of a stranger who had come from afar, dared not choose to live and die with this city. Many people's hearts were even shaken at that moment, although this only happened for a moment. Soon the fear of death took over. Perhaps many people, after being shaken at this moment, would still choose to leave in the end, choose to live and save their own lives. But, for the rest of their lives they would remember this moment. Remember the two people standing opposite each other in this hall at this moment? Remember the story that happened in the last moment of this city's survival? Remember that there were people who sacrificed everything for the glory and civilization of the Cruz people. And this was the legacy of civilization. Father Demande took a deep breath. He had already gotten everything he wanted. He raised his head and looked through the deep dome of the city hall, looking out through the skylight there. The gloomy sky was somewhat dazzling at this moment. The memories of the past seemed to have returned to his heart. He had experienced everything that Diomedes had told him before. It was because this city carried the past and memories of him, as well as the past of many people. It carried even more glory and history. Dabian might become a thing of the past, but this city would not. It would live in everyone's heart forever. And at the same time it would live forever. It was because of Salma's words that the covenant that had been silent for 1,000 years had been rejuvenated. Perhaps it was still only known as the alliance between Cloak Bay and the Hazel people, but it once had a name and it was called the Sacred Oath. Perhaps this name would soon be remembered again, and Father Damon believed that the arrival of that day might not be too far away. He slowly sat down and leaned against his seat. He did not remember what he had told the clerk, but this short negotiation that lasted only one night finally came to an end. Both sides were leaving and the scene was chaotic. From time to time, nobles came up to him to say goodbye. He could not remember the faces of those people at all. The clerk kept the record of the meeting, and then each side took a copy of it and left Dabian. Soon, the Hazel people would join the refugees from all over Cloak Bay and cross the Broken Sword Mountain range to the south to find a real way out. Dudermont closed his eyes and felt his tense nerves finally relax. The Hazel people might be facing a choice between life and death, but wasn't Cloak Bay the same? He had hardly been able to sleep peacefully these days. He did not know about the fiasco that the Hazel people had suffered in the north. He only knew that they had lost all contact with the Empire since the fall of the Black Moon. Without the support of the Empire, they could not possibly resist the invasion of the Hazel people. Not to mention the north of Cloak Bay had been cloudy for months. Throughout the day in most areas north of Dabian, pillars of smoke could be clearly seen rising into the sky, and at night flames could be seen soaring into the sky. No one knew what was going on in the Bankel region and the imperial capital. When he meditated, he could always feel the sea of magic boiling. The power of dusk seemed to be growing stronger by the day. Some news from the north also reminded him of some secrets of the Holy Cathedral. The Crystal Army was obviously the fangs and claws of dusk. However, the scouts sent to the north could not return once they crossed the Little Leaf Hill. The same was true for small fleets. After losing a few corvettes, Duke Diomedes gave up on the plan. The Sublime Sea had just entered a stormy period. In times of peace, no one would dare to enter the sea at this time, let alone when the tide of magic was surging. According to those who returned from the south, the Rokizi Highlands had become a new inland sea. Every road to Anzaruta had been cut off, unless one crossed the Broken Sword Mountain Range. However, the south of Broken Sword Mountain Range was the territory of the Lion Beastmen. Ever since Anzaruta Fortress was conquered by the Lion Beastmen, no one knew what was going on in the Ivory Plains. The way out was completely cut off, and Cloak Bay had become an isolated place in the sea. These days, the shadow of the north was gradually moving south. The imminent threat forced him to sit down and negotiate with the Hazel people. In this negotiation he not only needed to ensure the safety of Dabian and Cloak Bay, but also the survival of the entire empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Fortunately, for the first time he was glad that his enemy, or rather his opponent, was sufficiently wise and clear-headed. He had done his best. Now, the future of Cloak Bay was in the hands of the goddess of fate. P.S. The Worship Our event was written a little late. E5 has passed. Don't worry. Chapter 1365. She's gone. Delphian handed the cloth to Brando and smiled bitterly. Brando took the cloth and saw the words "Thank you" written on it in beautiful handwriting. Other than that, there was nothing else. The little girl's camp was already empty. Brando thought that he did not notice when she left at all. It seemed that she was not just lucky to be able to travel alone in the Tochik swamp for such a long time. Perhaps she had some means of concealing her whereabouts, or a magic item, or it could be an inheritance left by Bai, or a treasure of the Cipher family. But he did not know why she fell into the hands of the sheephead cult. After all, the little girl seemed to be very vigilant and cautious. Brando glanced at the extinguished campfire and opened the tent. It was empty. It seemed that she had at least taken some food with her. This discovery made him feel a little relieved. She shouldn't have gone far, Princess Magadol said with some worry. If we look around, we might be able to find her. Even if she has a tool to conceal her whereabouts, she must not be able to maintain it for a long time. Otherwise, she would not have fallen into the hands of the sheephead cult. Brando put down the tent curtain but shook his head. If we catch up with her, what can we do? If she is not willing to accept our help, there is no point in us forcing her. Mr. Brando, but I am also very worried about her, Princess Magadol. But everyone has to be responsible for their own choices. I believe that the little girl knows what she is doing. If it were you, would you accept charity from strangers? But that is not charity, we just want to help her. Perhaps in her eyes it's charity because she can survive without us. Brendel glanced at the cloth and replied, "She's thanking us. She's just thanking us for saving her. But she is still so young." Magadol thought of the scene of the little girl called Ling walking barefoot in the swamp. Her heart clenched. This swamp is so dangerous for adults. She is alone. She will encounter trouble, won't she? Don't worry, Brendel put away the cloth and said, "She'll go to hard lands? It's not far from here and she won't have to trek through the swamps for too long. I have a feeling that we might meet her again." Princess Magadol nodded. Although there was still some worry on her face, she did not speak any more. She also understood the importance of this line of work. It was impossible to waste too much time looking for a person aimlessly in the swamp. The sky was already bright, but Fang Qi still had not appeared. Brando was a little worried, not because he was afraid that Fang Qi would keep his promise. After spending so much time together, he knew that although the genius of the Chariot clan had a bad personality, he was a man of his word. He was worried that Fang Qi would encounter some trouble. Tao Chica was at the border of Madara civilization near the Dead Moon Inner Sea. This wetland swamp was actually another type of dark forest. In this day and age where the magic of chaos was becoming stronger day by day, no one could guarantee what they would encounter here. And Brando was sure that Fang Qi would encounter more trouble than this. Because of this, he decided to go to the meeting point in advance. If Fang Qi did not appear, then they would have to consider looking for a living person in the swamp. But this time it was not to look for a lonely little girl, but to look for a man who could lose himself. He let Princess Magadol and Mr. Liu help to clean up the camp, while he walked around the camp. Although Brando said that he would not care about the little half-elf girl, he still subconsciously paid attention to the traces near the camp. To his surprise, he did not find any footprints or similar traces of leaving within a mile or two of the camp. This made him somewhat amazed at the powerful effect of the item that could conceal one's whereabouts. The tents were quickly taken down. Brando did not let the others deliberately remove the traces of Shuang. He was not afraid that someone would chase after them from the direction of Malta. If they did, it would be nothing more than suicide. He did not mind killing a few more sheephead cult members. Moreover, it was only a little more than a day's journey from Maltaha to Daharlan. With the support of magic, they might be able to travel even faster. Those cultists from Maltaha could only eat the dust behind them. Everyone packed up their bags and changed back into the sheephead cult members' robes that made them feel extremely uncomfortable. They continued to head south. Until their figures disappeared in the mist of the swamp, the space in the half-open tent in the lonely camp suddenly twisted, and a small figure lifted a cloak and revealed herself. She slowly stood up from the tent and quietly looked in the direction that Brando and the others left. Her delicate face was as expressionless as ever. After a while, she lowered her head and pulled up the hood behind her back with both hands, covering her long silver hair and pointed ears. Finally, only her white chin was revealed. She looked back and silently glanced at her camp in the tent, then began to dismantle the tent. First, she used canvas and ropes to tie up the wooden sticks that supported the tent into a bag. Then she lifted the bag a little. It was a little heavy. But she only hesitated for a moment, then gritted her teeth and carried her backpack on her back. She glanced at the camp one last time as if looking for something worth taking away. Then she turned around and a small figure walked into the depths of the swamp, step by step. Brando and others obviously did not expect that the little girl would still stay in the camp, or even if they guessed it, they would not turn back easily. As he said, the little girl obviously did not want to stay and drag them down. So even if they found her, she would leave again sooner or later. And even if they forced her to stay, it would only hurt her little self-esteem. In fact, after a short conversation last night, he had already understood the thoughts of the little girl named Ling. Although he might not agree, he knew how to respect this little self-esteem because it was one of the few precious things left of the other party. Thinking of the little girl, and then thinking of Haku and Medisha, he saw more of Medisha's shadow in Ling than their cunning mother. He didn't know how Haku gave birth to such a daughter, or was this pride in her bones actually the nature of the Silver Elves? The group of people silently moved forward in the swamp. If it was said that when they first arrived here they were still somewhat curious about the surrounding environment, but after the period of curiosity passed, Tao Chica was completely worthy of using the worst language to curse, because this was a muddy pond, a large, gloomy and cold pool of water, monotonous, dry and full of danger. The watery grassland was full of undead and skeletons that had fallen into it. From time to time, an ugly and stinky ghoul would jump out and lunge at you. Even if you cut it in half with a sword, the liquid and maggots that crawled in and out of the corpse would make you so disgusted that you would vomit out what was left in your stomach and return it to the earth. However, in the face of battle, the two men consciously took the initiative to take responsibility. Huang Hua tried to fight the ghoul a few times, but after that she refused to fight again. Although the little princess was tenacious, there were still things that she was afraid of. Those maggots almost made her faint. Other than fighting, trekking in the swamp itself was troublesome. Although Mr. Lu and Huang Hua had the strength of elemental activation, this little trouble was nothing to them. Ever since Princess Magadol's creator, bloodline began to awaken, and with the blessing of the Book of Gaia, traveling in the swamp was not a difficult task. In fact, the Book of Gaia's help to the nun princess was far more than that. Earth magic had the most complete range of travel spells such as Big Stride, Guide the Road, Bridge Summoning, Terrain Ignoring, and so on. The terrain ignoring could even allow one to travel through lava areas without being harmed, let alone a mere swamp. However, Princess Magadol's magic was limited. Although she had the heart of the dragon, her mental strength was not coordinated enough, and she could not use too much of it. Currently, her magic was only enough for her alone. Although the nun princess did not say anything, she secretly seized the time to meditate and coordinate her mental strength. She probably thought that her magic could not help others in this adventure, which made her feel a little apologetic. Brando had some understanding of the princess's serious and kind character. Among the few of them, the one who had the hardest time was the Prime Minister's daughter, who had been acting as if nothing had happened. Although Delphian was not very strong, she had learned magic and swordsmanship. However, because of the polluted spring of life, these powers had been washed away, and she had become a complete ordinary person. Although Brando had kept her in the Dead Moon card deck, because the Mephistopheles and Andrique were not here, there was no way to reset the card. Therefore, she had been maintaining the strength of an ordinary person. Just as Princess Magadol was worried, even an ordinary adult would have a hard time traveling in the swamp. This was because there were no so-called roads in the swamp. Everywhere was shallow water and muddy land. Once one walked into the swamp, one would not only sink into the mud, but also be surrounded by aquatic plants. If one accidentally walked into a quagmire, without a companion to save them, they might even lose their lives. Chapter 1366. In fact, even if there was no danger, traveling in the swamp was a purely physical activity. It was fine on their first day here yesterday. In fact, including the time they spent in Martaha, they had only traveled in the swamp for half a day. Martaha was built on high ground, and the environment around the town was much better than the depths of the swamp. But today, going deeper into the swamp, trouble came one after another. Coupled with the weakening of her physical strength, Delphian could not hold on any longer. For this reason, Brando deliberately slowed down a step, letting Huang Hua and Mr. Lu walk in front. He came to Delphian's side and looked at the sweaty, almost exhausted daughter of the Prime Minister. He could not help but shake his head. No wonder she said she saw his shadow in Ling. At least in terms of putting on a brave front, the two were indeed the same. "Sir, are you dissatisfied with this vicious woman's dragging speed?" Sensing Brando's arrival, Delphian smiled weakly and self-deprecatingly before he could speak. "Do I have such a sinister intention in your heart?" Brando replied unhappily. He had intended to help, but he was still a little dissatisfied with the way she described him, even though he knew that she might have done it on purpose. "Isn't that so? Sir, aren't you deliberately trying to drive me away from you? In fact, I also understand that men are like this. After they have had their fill, they throw a woman who has lost her value to the side and let her fend for herself." "What do you mean by, have your fill?" Brando almost stepped on air and staggered. Why was this saying different from last night? He could not help but stare at this woman a little dumbfounded. Delphian looked at his dumbfounded expression and could not help but laugh. She was originally the first beauty of Rushta. Although she had a bad relationship with Brando before, at the moment when she let down her guard, at least this smile made Brando realize that she was absolutely worthy of the title of the flower of the capital. The Prime Minister's daughter had a slender figure, and her snow-white neck was extremely beautiful and dazzling. Even wearing the sheep's head disciple's robe could not completely hide her beauty. When she smiled, that kind of warm smile seemed to overflow from her purple eyes. This kind of warmth could infect people's hearts, and Brando could not help but feel a little moved in his heart. But this slight movement also made the alarm bell in his heart ring. He could not be blamed for being timid. It was really because of her previous bad behavior that made him feel a lingering fear in his heart. But he could not do anything to her. In fact, after these days of getting along, especially after she had sincerely helped him many times, and after the long conversation last night, he understood that he could not simply decide whether she stayed or left, or even whether she lived or died. "I'm just joking with you, sir." Delphian pursed her lips and smiled. "Of course I still remember what I said yesterday. I made you hate me, so I will definitely leave when the time comes." For some reason, when he heard her say this, Brando did not feel as relaxed as he originally expected. Originally, he should be happy to get rid of this scheming woman. Even if he was not happy, he should at least feel relieved. But for some reason, instead of feeling relieved, he felt a little uncomfortable. The Prime Minister's daughter noticed Brando's expression and smiled slightly. She seemed a little happy, but her expression quickly dimmed. Originally, she wanted to tease the Count of Tonagel a few more words, but when the words reached her mouth, she was not in the mood to say it again, so she remained silent. "Do you need help?" Brando was silent for a moment before he asked dryly. "How do you plan to help me, sir? Carry me forward?" The Prime Minister's daughter's eyes turned and she asked. Brando thought for a moment and felt that this suggestion was a little stupid. If he carried the Prime Minister's daughter forward, it would not be of any help to her current situation other than taking advantage of her. At first, he wanted to lift her up and fly, just like what he did to Insursta and Fang Qi, but he suddenly realized that his idea was a little thoughtless. At least it was too rude for a lady. Being overcautious doesn't seem like something the Count would do. Delphian replied. "Sir, where is the courage you had to challenge the Empire during the Battle of Ampere Seal?" Brando glanced at her and suddenly approached her. He bowed slightly, put one hand under her knee, and the other hand holding the Prime Minister's daughter's back. Then he straightened up, and in the Prime Minister's daughter's cry of surprise, carried her horizontally and flew forward. Delphian probably did not expect Brando to do this, and a rare look of surprise appeared on her face. But she curled up in Brando's arms, hesitated for a moment, and did not speak again. She just silently pressed her cheek against the latter's chest. "Count," she whispered, "if one day I can no longer survive in the Empire, will you take me in? As a friend, the Abbey's domain will always open its doors to you." "Thank you." Delphian's eyes flashed, but there was some regret. After an hour or two, Brando and the rest finally met up with Fang Qi south of Malta. Although this guy did not lose him as Brando expected, he did not have a good night in the past. The first problem was the mosquitoes in the swamp. This seemingly insignificant problem was, in fact, the biggest problem for travelers in Teokike Swamp at night. With the perfect body, as one's strength increased, so would one's physique. The strengthening of one's physique could strengthen one's immune system, greatly increasing the body's recovery ability and resistance against various diseases and toxins. A strong physique would allow one to be completely unafraid of being infected by mosquitoes. In fact, the invading bacteria and foreign proteins would be completely wiped out by the immune system before they could even pass through the first line of defense. Unfortunately, not being infected by diseases was one thing, but the necessary steps would not be missed. The skin would become red and swollen, and although it recovered very quickly with the support of elemental strength, it would still cause discomfort and itching. No matter how strong Fang Qi was in terms of elemental strength, as long as he had not reached the last step of the perfect body, he would inevitably have to face these problems that ordinary people faced. Brando knew that this egomaniac had not made any preparations before entering the swamp, which was why he was so strange when the other party made the request yesterday. They had suffered so much last night even with the help of insect repellent, not to mention this guy had spent the night alone in the wild. He could only imagine how miserable this guy's situation was. In fact, he was not afraid that the other party would escape alone, and that was one of the reasons. When Huang Hua saw Fang Qi's face, hands, and exposed skin in front of them, she could not help but laugh. In Brando's eyes, this guy's outfit was like a terrorist from his previous life. Under the hood, only a pair of eyes could be seen rolling around. He even glared fiercely at Brando, probably realizing that he had been tricked again. "You damned guy," Fang Qi saw him and could not help but say, "Did you deliberately not warn me?" His voice was a little muffled under the hood, and even Princess Magadol could not help but look over, wondering what kind of inhumane treatment this guy had encountered. Only Delphian, who had just broken free from Brando's arms, had not calmed down yet. Her face was a rare shade of red, and she did not have the leisure to notice what was happening here. Brendel snickered in his heart. He was very familiar with Fang Qi's outfit. In his previous life, when he first ventured into the swamp, he didn't look at the guide posted by his senior sister on the BBS. As a result, he forgot to bring some necessities and traveled in the swamp for less than 2 days. At that time he was dressed exactly like Fang Qi. As a result, he was laughed at by the other members of the exploration team for a long time. Regarding his experience at that time, Bai Jia only had one word: "You deserved it." And now, this was what he wanted to say to this egomaniac. "Remind you of what?" he asked. Fang Qi quickly pulled off the scarf, covering his mouth, but suddenly realized that he was no match for him and could only bitterly say, "Give me the insect repellent." Brando shook his head but did not make things difficult for this guy. In fact, if Fang Chi had taken the initiative to ask for it a day ago, he would not have hidden it. But since this genius was so arrogant, he did not mind teaching him an unforgettable lesson. After this episode, Fang Chi seemed to have finally realized that he was not omnipotent, or that he had taken advantage of others. After receiving the life-saving gadget from Brando, this genius finally stopped acting alone. As Brando expected, the map given to them by Queen Madara was very detailed. Although the road between Martaha and Hardland was muddy and difficult to walk on, it was not too far in a straight line. In some places, there were even trestles built by merchants in the swamp before the year of the Dragon King. In fact, before the Sheepshead believers occupied this area, Hardland was once inhabited, but that was nearly half a century ago. At present, most of these trestles had been weathered and rotted in the swamp, and only a few remained, serving as road signs for travelers. Following these artificial road signs, the group arrived at Hardland the next morning, but the closer they got to the port in the south of Tokik, the more Sheepshead believers they encountered along the way. It seemed that what the innkeeper in Martaha said was true. This time, the Sheepshead believers held a large-scale live sacrifice ceremony in Hardland, and the Sheepshead believers in several nearby areas were inspired and gathered here. In fact, when they trekked through the night, they met several groups of Sheepshead believers who were also traveling at night. Although the two sides did not have much interaction from the way the Sheepshead believers dressed, Brando found that some of these Sheepshead believers did not seem to be from the area around the Sea of the Dying Moon. This showed that this live sacrifice had been prepared for a long time, and the news had been spread for a long time. However, this was obviously not good news for Brando and the others because they were not here to participate in this nuisance of a live sacrifice, but for the mystery of the jadeite. They were not looking forward to this live sacrifice ceremony at all, and they might as well destroy it. But the many Sheepshead believers gathered here were a problem. Chapter 1367. Ping Ping Ping. Lute retracted his wings and landed on the windowsill. He raised his hand and knocked on the bottom glass of the window. A small face soon appeared behind the foggy glass. It was clearly a little girl. She looked no more than 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing an exaggeratedly large hood. Under the hood were silver bangs and slender eyebrows. Under the eyebrows were a pair of big eyes that seemed to be able to speak. A faint layer of light floated above the silver pupils. She was wearing a pair of glasses on the bridge of her nose. The round frame of the glasses had a slit on the left side of the glass lens. Her face was a little red. When she saw the little fairy outside the window, her face quickly showed a happy look. She quickly opened the window bolt and let the little fairy fly in. "Are you okay, Mr. Lute? Did you find my sister? Was she caught by the Sheepshead cult? Is she okay?" The little girl waited for Lute to fly into the room and immediately closed the window. She couldn't wait to ask a lot of questions. "I'm sorry, Lotus. The security in the square is too tight. I can't get there. I don't know if your sister is there." Lute flew straight to a desk. There was a thick layer of dust on the desk. There was a place on the desk that was wiped clean. He sat there and answered. Lotus's face suddenly turned pale. She leaned against the chair helplessly and said, "You still haven't found my sister." Lute glanced at her and comforted her. "You don't have to worry too much. Those guys haven't started their living sacrifice ceremony yet. If your sister really fell into their hands, she should be safe for the time being. Damn it, if only this was Erwin. I know a very powerful guy there. He can definitely help us. Mr. Lute, you don't have to worry. My sister and I spent some time in Aween with my mother when we were young. We will definitely find a way to help you find your way home." Lotus finally calmed down after hearing Lute's words. She even comforted him in a crisp voice. "I've said many times that it's not my home. My home is in the Scorching River. It was originally connected to the Shallow Sea and the Storm-Stop Mountain, but now it should have been thrown into the void. It's not so simple to go back." Lute shook his head. "But I do have to go to Erwin to find that person and see if he has returned to his homeland. After rescuing your sister, we'll go to Erwin together. Anyway, you don't have any relatives here." Lotus nodded. She was looking forward to the future described by the little sprite. She replied sincerely, "Thank you very much for staying to help us, Mr. Lute." The little sprite was not polite. He stayed to help the little girl purely because he felt sorry for her. When he first met Lotus, she was being chased by the Sheephead cult. Later, he learned that Lotus wanted to rescue her sister, so she was discovered near the square. According to Lotus's description, she and her sister were on their way to the land of eternal death when they were ambushed by a group of cultists. Her sister pushed her into a ditch by the side of the road in a moment of crisis, and that was how they managed to escape. However, when she woke up, the two sisters were already separated. Later, she heard that the sheephead cult was attacking everywhere to prepare for a living sacrifice 2 months later. She speculated that her sister might have fallen into the hands of the sheephead cult, so she came to Hardland. However, although Lotus was young, she was very smart and had a sweet tongue. In fact, she took a detour to Port Ovich in the northern part of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. From there she took a free boat to Hardland. The boat was actually a merchant ship that ran a fixed route between Hardland and the northern part of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. On the ship, she met a priest of the Dead Moon Temple who was also the ship's doctor. The doctor sympathized with her and brought her to Hardland. He wanted to help her find her sister. But Lotus knew that the captain and crew of the ship did not have much influence in the upper echelons of Hardland. In order not to get them into trouble, she quietly left a note and went ashore. The crew went ashore to look for her for a while, but in the end they found nothing. Outsiders could only stay in Hardland for a limited time. In the end, the crew had no choice but to return. Perhaps they hoped that the little girl and her sister would have a good ending. Not long after that, Lotus met Lute in the process of looking for her sister. In fact, it was the sprite who saved her life. Lute was very sympathetic to the little girl, and after knowing that she and her sister came to Madara from Erewhon, he was even more determined to help her rescue her sister. Then the three of them went to Erewhon to find Brando. In fact, he had wasted too much time in the wilderness since he was thrown into this place from outside the elemental barrier. Although he had a good understanding of the human world, it was all knowledge from books. He had never come to the prime material plane before. Once he was in the wilderness, all the methods he knew to identify directions were useless. He could not understand the maps he stole from the bandits and merchants. He had taken a detour all the way to Hardland. He had thought that it was a port in the Dark Star Sea and planned to take a boat from here to White Mountain or Silver Bay controlled by the Wind Elves. From there he would take a boat to Erewhon. But he did not expect to run into the Dead Moon Inland Sea. He had originally landed on the east side of the Undead Sequence, which was very close to the Dark Star coast. He did not expect to walk further and further in the past 2 months. This discovery made Lute very depressed. For the first time he doubted his ability to find his way. Therefore, if he did not want to walk in circles in Madara forever, the half-elf sisters might be his only savior. The fairies were often superstitious about the guidance of the stars. Lute believed that it was the stars that led Lotus to him that night. Other than her sister, Lotus had no other relatives. Although she remembered living with her mother for a period of time when she was young, they were still living in Erewhon, a place called Lantern Island. Not long after, their mother left them in a local monastery. Before leaving, their mother left a large sum of money to the monastery's dean and them. She also told them that if they wanted to find her in the future, they could go to Madara in the south. But before that, they had to have the ability to protect themselves first. According to the tradition of the Silver Elves, they had to be adults before they had the right to travel. But not long after their mother left, the monastery's dean, greedy for the money that belonged to them, found a way to drive them out of the monastery. Lotus and her sister only carefully kept one of their mother's relics. She had a beautiful necklace pendant, while her sister had a cloak. After that, the two of them wandered around Manowar and Bragg's, struggling to survive. About 10 years ago, her sister managed to get a sum of money. Then the two sisters left Erewhon and came to Madara together. But it was easier said than done to find a specific person in the vast kingdom of the Dead Moon. Moreover, it had been nearly half a century since their mother left them. Whether their mother was still alive was still a question. Otherwise, how could she bear to leave the two sisters in Erewhon and not care about them? After wandering around Madara for a few years, the two sisters went to most of the northern parts of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. This time, they wanted to go to the Land of Eternity to find their mother's whereabouts. They heard that there was a woman called White among the Night of the Queen of the Dead, and the name White was one of their mother's aliases. But they didn't expect to encounter such a thing on the way. Lute agreed with Lotus's experience. Although he had his own people and relatives, fairies were born without parents. Most of the time, they were driven by their own curiosity to wander around. Some fairies even came to the main plane, such as Miss Tata's sister Rose. Although Lute had never been to the prime material plane, he had traveled to most places outside of the elemental domain before meeting Brando. The two were silent for a moment. During this time, Lute drank some honey to fill his stomach. He stole it from a kitchen. Of course, it wasn't stealing for fairies because they didn't have the concept of money. In their view, everything in the world was natural, and there was no such thing as a master. In fact, other than his sword, which was as important as his life as a swordsman, he would not hesitate to take out everything he had if there was another person who needed it more. Of course, in reality, most fairies were poor people who were born empty-handed and lived their lives without any worries. Lotus also ate a few biscuits, but she ate very little, although most of them were stolen by loot. However, the little girl treasured all food. Only those who had experienced hunger would understand the value of food. She wanted to let her sister have a taste of these exquisite biscuits after she was rescued. I thought about it, Loot said vaguely as he sucked the honey on his fingertips. We should do this. I heard that humans like to go to a place called bar. We can go there and ask for some information. Maybe we can find some useful information. Yes. Lute nodded. I'm too conspicuous here. You have to be the one to gather information. When the time comes, I'll hide in your hood. You just have to listen to my commands. You can't go wrong. Okay. Lotus's eyes lit up. If it wasn't for the fact that the little minx strictly forbade her from leaving this place every time she went out, she wouldn't have wanted to stay in this empty abandoned house by herself. Besides, in her opinion, although the little minx was very powerful, he wasn't very reliable. It had been half a month, and this was the first time she thought of asking for information. She didn't know if the fairy was too muddle-headed or not familiar with the way the human world worked. Chapter 1368. Let me say this first, you have to listen to my instructions. Lute reminded her again. The little girl nodded quickly. Then where are we going, Mr. Lute? Don't worry, I've already scouted the area. There's a bar called Purple Dendrobium near the square. It's very close to the square, so I'm sure we can find out a lot of information. But Mr. Lute, the Lord of Hardlands, Lord Danook, has already issued a ban on alcohol. Before the ritual starts, those bars won't be open, right? Lute was stunned. There's such a thing? Rin nodded solemnly. Then what should we do? Do those despicable humans like to go anywhere else other than bars? The residents of this city are all believers of the sheep-headed demon, Akentu. They don't have to drink, but they have to attend the secret gathering. I know a place that I've been there before. Every Friday the believers of Akentu will gather there. They will pray at the gathering and exchange some information. Friday, isn't that today? Yes, it's only 5 in the afternoon. Akentu's name is the Burning Dusk, and the demons worship the Dusk Dragon. Therefore, the secret gathering of its believers is usually held at 6 in the afternoon and lasts until 8 in the evening. If we go now, we can still make it in time. Rin spoke with confidence as if she was very familiar with these things, even though she had only been in Hardlands for a week or two. Then what are we waiting for? Lute said loudly. Go, change into the sheep-headed demon's clothes and we'll leave immediately. The little girl smiled and nodded happily. Secret gathering? Brando, Huanghua, and Mr. Lu were walking on one of the streets of Hardlands. Magadal and Delphian were standing together, curiously admiring the architecture and customs of the northern part of the Dead Moon Inland Sea. Fang Qi was alone at the back of the group, looking at the sheep-headed demon's believers who were dressed like them from the corner of his eyes. After hearing Delphian's words, Huanghua turned around and asked curiously. The Prime Minister's daughter nodded her head. Her gaze swept across the sheep-head disciples who were hurrying towards a certain direction on the street. The secret gathering is a specific ritual of the sheep-head cult. The sheep-head cult is a follower of the Lord of Purgatory, Akentu. As a follower of a demon, the secret gathering is an essential and important ritual. Just like the meditation and daily prayers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as long as one is a devout believer, they will participate. The devil's believers are generally fanatics and will not be absent. However, Akenta only requires its believers to hold a ceremony once a week, during which it will bestow power to its most trusted servant. This day is chosen on Friday because Friday is the day when the power of the moons is the strongest. On this day the moonlight will cover the power of Martha, and Akenta's name is Burning Dusk, so the ceremony usually starts at 6 in the evening. Isn't it now? Huanghua looked at the sheep-head disciples and understood. So they are. Delphian nodded and looked at Brando. Brando was frowning. He was not Huanghua, and he did not know much about the traditions and rules of some of the cultists in Wond. With the experience of his previous life, he knew the roots of these rats living under the world of order. What Delphian said was just the tip of the iceberg of Akenta's secret church. What made him feel a little troubled was that they were unlucky and happened to run into a secret gathering point of Akenta's believers nearby. If possible, Brando did not want to waste time here, but the problem was that they were now dressed as sheephead disciples. If they did not go, they might arouse suspicion. Then do we have to participate? Huang Hua asked again. I'm afraid we have to go, otherwise it will be too conspicuous, Delphian said. Besides, the secret gathering of Akenta's believers is also a channel for them to exchange information with each other. Brando nodded. It seemed that he could only hope that they could get some useful information at this secret gathering. Mr. Liu and Princess Magadol did not have any objections. In the case of majority rule, Fang Qi knew that it was useless even if he had any objections, so he just shrugged and followed. They were originally dressed as sheephead disciples, and at this moment, they were walking in the direction of the believers. Although they had a child, Huang Hua, it did not look too eye-catching. After all, Hadran was a city where the sheepshead believers lived. It was normal for a family of 3 to believe in Akentu, so there was nothing noteworthy about the secret gathering where the believers went with their whole family. In fact, Brando saw several short figures, some walking with adults and some even walking alone. There was even a little girl who almost bumped into him because she was walking with her head down. She quickly raised her head and apologized to him. Brando saw that the little girl was wearing a pair of glasses and had a gentle look. He could not help but feel that it was a pity that such a nice little girl was poisoned by the cult. However, he was a little surprised that a sheephead disciple was so polite. Most of the sheephead disciples they met along the way were vulgar and low-class people who had not received any education and lived in poverty. Otherwise, they would not have been so easily bewitched. But it was precisely because of this that Brando felt even more pity in his heart. The hatred for the sheephead disciples in his heart was inexplicably stronger. If he had the chance, he would definitely not let this kind of cancer continue to spread on this land. But what Brando did not know was that the little girl who was bewitched by the cult was so scared that her heart was about to jump out of her throat. As she hurried forward, she kept looking back in the direction of the sheephead disciple that she almost bumped into earlier, as if she was afraid that the other party would suddenly run up and pull her out of the crowd. I told you to be more careful. Lute hid in the little girl's hood and sat on her shoulder, complaining discontentedly. Fortunately, I didn't attract that guy's attention, but strange, why do I feel that his voice is so familiar? Lotus stuck out her tongue embarrassedly and whispered, I'm sorry, I was too nervous. However, she had a very different view of the crisis from before. What scared her half to death wasn't the fact that she almost ran into the cultist head-on. Although the followers of Akentu were fierce and aggressive, at this important time, they would not easily cause trouble. This was like saying that the followers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would not fight with other members on the way to prayer and meditation. If they destroyed the gathering and angered Akentu, they would end up in a miserable state that could not be easily described by the word death. But what really made Lotus uneasy was her small mistake. When she bumped into the other party, she subconsciously blurted out an apology. When did the followers of Akentu become so timid and easy to talk to? Fortunately, the other party did not seem to notice this. Instead, he said to her very gently, "It's okay, be careful next time." This sentence made Lotus's heart pound because she understood that among the believers present, the real threat to her and Mr. Lute was not the vulgar low-level believers. It was the highly educated, meticulous high-ranking clergy and even the devil's inspectors. If those people found out that she was pretending to be a believer, she would be skinned even if she did not die. Unlike Lute's carelessness, Brando's gentle and elegant answer almost made her hair stand on end. But what made her a little incredulous was that the other party let her go just like that. This was really too strange, so much so that she felt that it was a little unreal. With doubts and uneasiness in her heart, the little girl absent-mindedly followed the crowd into a church-like building. This is. When Brando stood in front of the church, he raised his head and looked at the place with some surprise. A temple? The cultists are openly using a temple as their secret meeting place? Princess Magadol also had a look of disbelief. This feeling was similar to when she saw a group of all-for-one members or tree herders praying in the Holy Cathedral of Fire in Ampere Seal or Rushta. They are simply too. It seems that Queen Madara is right. These people have already regarded this place as their territory. Not only can they openly spread the teachings of the sheep's head cult, but they even made such a church? Brando could not help but shake his head. They are completely treating the teachings of the sheep's head Akentu as an orthodox religion and openly spreading it. It seems that the situation is not good. Delphian and Magadol both understood that Brando meant that the sheep's head cult had learned that the Black Rose of the Roman Tuaw might be moving north. This way Tao Chica would never return to the rule of the Mercury staff. This was why the Hardlands dared to be so fearless. Otherwise, these dark nobles would at least maintain the necessary respect for Madara on the surface. But the fact that the undead gave up on the land of eternity and migrated north happened before they left. It was unlikely that it would spread to Tao Chica at this time. This could only mean one possibility, and that was that the Sheep's Head cult had secretly contacted the Minions of Dusk. As for whether the other party was a demon or something else, it was a little hard to say. After the people present secretly exchanged this opinion, their faces were a little ugly for a while. Brando had a faint premonition in his heart that this trip was going to be troublesome again. P.S. I accidentally entered the title number wrong again. It is very troublesome to change the starting point of the chapter name. That's it, as long as everyone understands. Chapter 1369. Brendel and the others followed the flow of people slowly. When they passed through a long corridor and entered the main hall, they saw many carvings of the spider maids on the walls. There was even a tall statue at the end of the corridor that was not destroyed in time. It was covered with a layer of black cloth, and it was obvious that it was the statue of the spider goddess. It seemed that this temple was originally a waning moon temple. The sheep-head disciples did not have the time to occupy the sparrow's nest for long, so much so that even the remodeling was completed in a hurry. However, the other sheephead followers weren't surprised by this. They didn't even look at the statue covered in black cloth. They either buried their heads and moved forward, or whispered to each other. Demons worshipped chaos, and their followers naturally couldn't be too orderly. Not causing trouble at the gatherings was already the limit. It was obviously impossible to achieve the effect of the weekly gatherings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the believers of the Holy Church. Not only was it impossible, but it might even annoy the demons they worshipped. The believers passed through the corridor and entered a hall. This hall was naturally in the style of the Waning Moon Temple, but the statue in the north of the hall had been destroyed. The pedestal where the statue was originally placed was empty, and there was no replacement. From this point, it could be seen that the sheephead believers did not occupy this temple for too long. Brando noticed that along the way he did not see any related clergy. The original owner of this Waning Moon Temple must not have had a good end. He was most likely a prisoner or perhaps a living sacrifice. After the believers entered the hall, they each found their own seat and sat down. Those who did not have a seat stood in different corners. Soon, a senior priest of the sheephead believers came to preside over the ceremony. This ceremony was very simple. It was to sprinkle the blood of a black goat on the believers. Brando, Delphian, and Magadol were already very familiar with the sheephead believers, so they were not too resistant to it. However, Huang Hua and Mr. Lu were not used to it. The blood of livestock was regarded as filth in the 9 phoenixes. Sprinkling livestock's blood on others was a great insult, let alone upper nobles like them. Fortunately, both of them knew what the situation was, so they could only grit their teeth and bear with it. Although Huang Hua almost could not help but draw her sword several times to cut the priest who sprinkled the goat's blood on her in half, she could not do it in the end. When Fang Qi saw the goat's blood flying towards him, he subconsciously dodged and let the blood fall on the ground of the temple. Fortunately, he was standing at the back of the holy cathedral between 2 pillars. The light was dim. Perhaps it was intentional, but the high-ranking cleric did not notice that the goat blood he shot had missed its target. This caused Fang Qi to heave a huge sigh of relief in his heart. He was actually not afraid of his identity being exposed, but he was afraid of ruining Brendel's matter. What if Brendel wanted to ask him for the sacred jade sword? It was sad to say that the Holy Jade Imperial Sword was originally the sacred object of the Ghost Chariot clan, and now he seemed to be the one who had taken over the Holy Jade Imperial Sword. However, Fang Qi knew the gap between him and that damn guy. Although he was very reluctant, he had to admit that even if he was the Ghost Chariot clan's genius in 1,000 years, he was not enough in front of that man. If he wanted to keep the Holy Jade Imperial Sword, he had to satisfy the other party's request, and then it depended on whether the other party was in a good mood. Fortunately, the Ghost Chariot clan had always believed in the truth, that the strong were respected, so Fang Qi did not feel wronged. What made him feel wronged was the smelly outfit he was wearing. This was a compromise he had to make in order to enter the Hardlands. Of course, he did not have to enter the port, but when he thought of staying in the swamp alone for a few days, this high and mighty genius had to bow to reality. The smelly robe of the sheephead cult was almost the limit of his tolerance. How could he tolerate someone spilling the blood of livestock on him? His dodging action was purely a subconscious expression of disgust in his heart. Fortunately, it did not attract anyone's attention. Fang Qi rejoiced in his heart, but he did not expect that his action had already fallen into Delphian's eyes. The Prime Minister's daughter immediately reported it to Brando, and naturally, Brando quietly noted this guy's score in his heart. He was not as naive as Fang Qi in his heart. Perhaps it was because he knew more about the sheephead cult. He knew that the high-ranking priest of the cult must have noticed the abnormality long ago. However, demons were cunning and cold, and everything followed their master. Most of their followers naturally flocked together, especially those who could climb to the top of these cult organizations. Most of them were originally elites in various fields, and they were even more cunning and shrewd. Otherwise, it would be impossible for them to survive in an environment where the faith of the 5 holy temples dominated the mainstream and the cult was strictly guarded against heretics. How could such a person be careless? The high-ranking priest must have noticed the difference in strength between him and Fang Qi. On the surface he did not say anything, but in private he would immediately mobilize people immediately. Moreover, even if the other party really did not notice, when the ritual was about to begin, Akenta's projection would descend, and he would discover that there were people who did not have the smell of the black sheep's blood on them. Brando secretly cursed, but he understood that he was also responsible. Because of the sudden incident in this secret gathering, he forgot to remind the others of what to pay attention to. He also did not expect that there were 3 people from the 9 Phoenix in his team who did not know anything about the sheephead cult, and he did not expect Fang Qi to be so deceitful. However, although he knew that Fang Qi might have been exposed, he did not show any abnormalities on the surface. He only gave Delphian a look, telling her to calm down. Then he turned his head and asked a follower beside him, "My companion, I just came from Martak. My friend, I've just rushed here from Malta. It seems that I'm still in time to participate in this grand event?" The sheephead cult follower was stunned, but he did not show any vigilance because there had been a continuous stream of followers from other areas rushing to de Havilland for the past 2 months. Now the population in de Havilland City, or rather the sheephead cult followers, had more than doubled its resident population. Therefore, it caused the prices of goods to skyrocket, and there were more incidents of provocation and trouble. After all, the sheephead cult followers were also human, and they had to face the problems of birth, old age, illness, and death. In the early days, the residents of de Havilland City might still be a little vigilant, afraid that there would be spies from the waning moon holy cathedral in this sacred ceremony. However, after that period of novelty, the locals despised these foreigners and did not even care about their friendship with their followers. After all, no one wanted their original income to shrink, and the things they could buy on the market would be reduced to half of the original price or even less. Under such circumstances, when the de Havilland residents were accosted on the street, the chances of encountering foreigners were probably higher than encountering their neighbors. Therefore, any vigilance they had would probably be reduced after a series of jitters. Needless to say, the brother that Brando asked at this moment was also an outsider. The sheephead cult follower came from Otto in the east of de Havilland, and he was just a step ahead of Brando and the others. Therefore he nodded and said, "My friend, you're lucky. Although Sir Canute announced that the ceremony would be brought forward, you just happened to arrive a day earlier. If you were 2 days later, I'm afraid you wouldn't be able to make it." Brando was not surprised by this answer. In fact, he had already captured some interesting content from the conversations of the sheephead cult followers around him. If not for Fang Qi, he might have chosen a more suitable time to cut into the topic. For example, after the secret ceremony, there would be a small gathering among the sheephead cult followers. At that time, the atmosphere would be more lively and chaotic, and the vigilance of the sheephead cult followers would be reduced to the lowest. But now that he was about to be exposed, he could not care so much. He could only take the risk and seize the time. After listening to the words of the sheephead cult follower, Brando deliberately showed a look of surprise, and asked, "Brought forward, my friend, did something happen in the middle?" "My friend" was a commonly used term among the sheephead cult followers. This term had the same meaning as my brother, father, and brother, among the followers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando deliberately used this term here to reduce the other party's vigilance, but his performance was for the blind, because the brother did not care about Brando's identity at all and only said with some fanaticism, "Indeed, something big has happened. My friend, I heard that the undead have been defeated. They are about to give up the land of eternal death and retreat to the north. This is a great victory of the will of the twilight. My Lord is about to descend into this world, and the day of the end of the world judgment is coming. Victory is not far from you and me, my friend." Brando's eyes widened. "When did the undead lose?" It was clearly because of the fall of the goddess of the dead moon that they had to give up the land of eternal death. And in the battle at Fenhodos, it was clear that the Earth Legion had won again. It seemed that it was not only the ruling bodies of the major empires that would spread false news and whitewash the peace for the sake of their own political stability. He did not expect that the subordinates of the Twilight Dragon, one of the ultimate will of the world, would be the same. This made him feel greatly disappointed, and he was full of contempt for the subordinates of the merchant lady. However, his expression fell into the eyes of the sheephead cult follower, which turned into shock and disbelief. This expression was not surprising because when he first heard the news, his face showed the same expression. Chapter 1370. After all, although the sheephead cult claimed to be the followers of Akentu, everyone knew that the demons were suppressed to the scorching hell and could not return to the main material plane. They were actually the losers of the war. The master of the sheephead cult, the king of purgatory, Akentu, and several other demon lords were sealed, and their whereabouts were unknown. Their followers could not find them even after thousands of years. Ever since the Battle of the Azure Sky, the power of order had become so powerful that the believers of Dusk had almost become the lackeys that everyone wanted to beat. These people who lived at the bottom of society and were even like rats crossing the street. When did they think that one day they would be able to turn things around? It was because of this that this victory and the upcoming ceremony were so significant to them. Sure enough, Brando's face quickly showed a look of ecstasy. He tried to raise his voice as high as possible so that only a few people around him could hear, and shouted in a low voice, "It's true, the undead have moved north." Where did the rumor come from? He thought in his heart. The undead had only moved north in the past 1 or 2 days. How did it reach Tao Chica so quickly? Could it be that someone was using magic crystals to send messages? Doesn't this mean that there are still spies of the sheephead cult around Queen Madara? When did the sheephead cult become so meticulous? Could it be that they changed their name to All for One? The conversation between Brando and the sheephead cult member obviously fell into the ears of others, but this question and answer was being played out everywhere in Hardland, and it did not attract the slightest attention. The sheephead cult members around them did not even have the mood to look back at the two of them. Brando's appropriate ecstasy was so normal in the eyes of the sheephead cult member that he struck up a conversation with, and it even gave him a sense of familiarity. But next to the two of them, Huang Hua, who had heard the whole conversation without missing a word, shook her head vigorously. She wanted to laugh but did not dare to laugh out loud, so her little shoulders were trembling. Teacher's acting is too exaggerated. The little princess of the Jade Phoenix lineage thought in her heart, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. The sheephead believer replied without any doubt, "Just 2 days ago we already gave up on the undead capital. However, this is not a rumor but Lord Akentu's teachings." Lord Akentu. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air, and asked, "Did anything happen in the Holy Land again?" After asking this question, his expression immediately became cautious. The hand hidden under the robe also faintly made a sword-holding posture, as if he was ready to make a move if something went wrong. In fact, this question was what he was most concerned about. The sheephead believers were discussing the changes in the Holy Land of Atuk with great interest, and they were connecting those changes with the upcoming living sacrifice ceremony. The advance of Hadran's living sacrifice ceremony was clearly related to the changes in the Holy Land. Originally, no matter how abnormal Akentu's seal was, it had little to do with Brando, but the secret of the mystery of Emerald might be buried in the Green Sea, which made him have to be careful and pay attention to all the news related to it. But he didn't know much about the Holy Land itself. The only information he had came from Maltaha's inquiry. After listening to the conversation of the sheephead believers, he understood that the information he bought was worthless, and he knew nothing about the core secrets of the Holy Land of Atuk. Because of this, he had to carefully find an entry point to avoid being too ignorant in the conversation and attracting the attention of others. However, no matter how good the preparation work was, he couldn't help but feel nervous when he asked this question, so he was ready to be exposed at any time. But the sheephead believer didn't seem to notice the difference at all. He just nodded and replied, "Yes, you guessed right. With the rise of the magic tide, the seal of the Holy Land of Atuk has become weaker and weaker. Lord Akentu may break out of the seal at any time. Maybe when our living sacrifice ceremony is over, Lord Akentu will be resurrected." Brando frowned. This was not the news he wanted. He hesitated for a moment and asked, "What's going on with the Holy Land of Atuk? Is it really the place where Lord Akentu was sealed?" "Of course, otherwise why would we come to this place?" The sheephead believer said proudly, I'll tell you a secret. In fact, the seal of the Holy Land of Atuk had already cracked as early as the first magic tide. Lord Akentu's will can already penetrate the Holy Land. He also left a clone in Hadran. That's why we know the news of the defeat of the undead. Brando thought to himself that the undead were defeated. It seemed that the king of Purgatory, Akentu, was also a bullshitter. But this guy in front of him inadvertently revealed a shocking news. The Holy Land of Atuk was really the place where the king of Purgatory, Akentu, was sealed, and the great demon had actually awakened in advance. He wanted to ask some more information about the Holy Land of Atuk, but it seemed that this guy knew very little about it. He only knew that the Holy Land of Atuk was above the inner sea of the Dead Moon, but he didn't know the specific sea area. He only knew that there was an archipelago there, and the sheephead believer had a stronghold and station on it. However, this information was enough. A lot of things could be obtained from the information provided by the Maltahayan owner. Brando had also heard about the archipelago. It was even marked on the map given to him by the Queen of Madara. It was called the Sea Serpent Archipelago. It was more than 300 nautical miles away from Hadran in a straight line. It was not too far, but it was not on the main sea route. It lacked natural resources, and it was also popular with the legend of ghost ships, so it had always been a very remote place. Now that Brando had obtained the specific location of the Green Sea, he was no longer in a hurry. Instead, he waited silently for the ceremony to begin. Anyway, Fang Chi might have been exposed, so he no longer worried about the problem later. It was better to calm down and analyze the information he had obtained before. After a while, another high-ranking priest came to preside over the next ceremony, and this high-ranking priest was obviously a different person. Brando could see from the other party's attire that the high-ranking priest of the sheephead believer had a stripe missing on his robe. It seemed that he was one level lower than the priest who spilled the sheep's blood. The other party had already discovered Fang Chi's identity and secretly called for someone. Thinking about this, he was even less flustered. After all, he had previously concealed his identity to inquire about information. However, since he couldn't hide it, there was nothing to say. In terms of strength, the sheephead believer of Hadran was nothing in his eyes, even if there was a greater demon avatar in the city lord's mansion. Legend had it that before Akenta was sealed, his strength was still a step away from being a demigod. That was to say, his body might only be at the peak of the sage realm. Then his avatar would be even worse. It might not even be at the level of a sage. At present, with Brando's realm, anyone below the sage realm could be killed with one strike of his sword. The sheephead disciples were obviously not ready for the time being, and they did not move for the time being. The replacement high-ranking priest presided over the ceremony on the altar, but his eyes kept glancing in Fang Chi's direction, which made Brendel feel a little funny. What made him even more speechless was that Fang Chi didn't even realize that he had been exposed. This guy even felt good about himself and pulled his robe with a disgusted look. The genius of the Phantom Chariot obviously didn't expect that the little trick he thought the other party didn't notice was actually noticed by a third party besides the sheephead believers and Brando. The third party was naturally Lotus and Lute, who had sneaked into the secret meeting place. At this moment, the little girl was standing in the most inconspicuous corner of the hall with Mr. Fairy. She carefully held her breath, for fear of attracting the attention of others. Since the first moment she entered the hall, most of her attention fell on Brando and the others. The reason was naturally because she was worried that her disguise had been seen through. In her heart, she had long believed that Brando was the legendary demon judge. But what surprised her was that the demon judge didn't seem to intend to trouble her. After entering the hall, he didn't even show any intention of looking for someone. She felt strange, and then she saw Fang Chi's little trick to avoid the sheephead believer's high-ranking priest's blood-flashing ceremony. Lotus was taken aback by this small action. She had a deep understanding of the sheephead cult. To be exact, she had a deep understanding of most of the organizations in the world, whether they were secret or public. She knew very well what this ceremony meant to the sheephead cult. When Fang Chi's small action fell into her eyes, she understood that other than herself, there were others who had sneaked into the holy temple. She rolled her eyes and remembered this detail in her heart, but she did not show it on her face. On the other hand, Mr. Little Fairy kept nagging at her to quickly find out more information, but Lotus chose to turn a deaf ear to him. She was very smart. She knew when to speak at this sensitive time was the best choice. If she rashly listened to the unreliable Mr. Fairy's opinion, she was afraid that the two of them would soon become prisoners. However, because Fang Chi had been deliberately standing far away from Brando and the others, Lotus didn't connect the two sides together for a while. The high-ranking cleric on the altar was already halfway through the ritual. He suddenly stood up and recited an obscure incantation in a deep voice. However, Brando and Lotus understood that it was not a spell at all, but the evil words of the devil. It meant to offer the soul to Akentu, the Lord of Purgatory, in exchange for the will from the abyss to come to the world. After this incantation, theoretically, Akentu's will would descend upon this secret meeting place. Of course, it would not be Akentu's own will. Not to mention that this Lord of Purgatory was currently in a sealed state. Even if he was in his prime, he would not be able to respond to the summons of every believer in this world. That was an ability that only demigods and gods had. However, the will that was summoned was the projection of the power of chaos. It represented that the power of the Lord of Purgatory would descend upon everyone present. It would also give the sheephead disciple a filthy blessing and punish those who made the demon king unhappy. Brando held his breath, and Lotus looked in the direction of Fang Qi. But the next moment, the hall was as silent as before and nothing happened for a while. Brando was stunned, thinking that this was a deliberate arrangement by the sheephead believers, but when he looked up, he found that the high-ranking priest standing on the altar was also stunned. The hall was quiet for a moment, and then the sheephead believers present reacted. It was not the first time they had participated in a secret meeting. Of course, they could feel that Lord Akentu's will had not come. Everyone raised their heads and looked around in shock, as if trying to figure out what had happened. What's the matter? Is Lord Akentu angry? Someone ruined the ceremony? Someone in the hall immediately questioned, and the scene was a little out of control for a while. The high-ranking priest on the altar jumped down and walked in the direction of Fang Qi. Brando saw the other party's action, and with a move of his hand, he had already grasped the hilt of Oderfice. But just as he was about to start, he heard a rush of footsteps coming from behind, and then someone outside the hall reprimanded, "All the believers of the Master, be quiet." The sheephead believers in the hall were startled and subconsciously quieted down. Brendel turned around and saw an important figure wearing a black robe that was obviously different from the ordinary members of the church. He was escorted into the hall by a group of people. Once he entered the hall, he looked around at everyone and said, "Believers of the Master, pick up your weapons, your Master needs you." Chapter 1371. The sudden appearance of the patriarch was like a spark falling into boiling oil, igniting the anger in the hearts of the sheephead believers. They were already in an uneasy and manic mood because of the failure of Akentu's arrival. After hearing the patriarch's words, there was a burst of angry screams in the hall. "Heretics have invaded Haterland? Kill them. They are the culprits who angered Lord Akentu." The patriarch was very satisfied with the reaction of the crowd. He took out a gray cloak and said, "The heretics have invaded Lord Akentu's territory and tainted the holy blood of dusk. I ask you to capture those heretics." After that, he glanced at the hall and happened to meet Brando's eyes under the hood. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He thought that he had been exposed. He was very curious. How did these people know about the relationship between Fang Qi and himself? But faster than his thoughts, in fact, the moment the other party looked at him, he had already lifted his robe and revealed the dark golden blade beneath, the blade of holy sword Oderfice. The patriarch's eyes widened when he saw Brando suddenly pulling out the sword from under his robe. He was just casually looking in this direction. No matter how he looked at it, the disciple's action of pulling out the sword was that of a veteran. Judging from his actions, it was obvious that he was not responding to Lord Akentu's call. "There are intruders here." The patriarch was alarmed. Just as he was about to speak, a childish voice suddenly came from the hall. "The heretics are there." Fang Qi heard a crisp bang. He was stunned to see a jar falling in a parabola at his feet and shattering into pieces. Before he could react to what the jar was, he saw a cloud of white smoke coming out of the broken jar. In the darkness, no one could tell who was the one who spoke, but the sound of the jar shattering seemed to have snapped the last string in the hearts of the fanatical believers. Everyone subconsciously looked in that direction and saw that the hall was already filled with smoke, as if someone had thrown a smoke bomb in the middle of the crowd. "There are heretics. There are heretics among us." The fanatical followers immediately let out a burst of screams and angrily squeezed in that direction, as if they wanted to drag out the guy who caused the chaos in the crowd. However, their actions not only failed to improve the situation, but also made the hall even more chaotic. Everyone was pushing and shoving each other. In order to compete for a position to better perform in front of Lord Akentu, some people even started tearing. Soon the tearing turned into a brawl, and the brawl evolved into a chaotic fight. The hall was in chaos. The followers in front and behind trampled on each other, and for a moment, screams were heard. As soon as Brendel pulled out his sword, he realized that the situation had turned out this way. He was stunned. The little girl's voice did not sound like Huang Hua's, but who else was trying to create chaos here other than them? However, this sudden scene just happened to help him. He calmed down and looked around. Suddenly he realized that no one seemed to notice him at all. He was originally dressed as a sheephead disciple. Even if he pulled out his sword, the fanatical believers beside him only thought that he was responding to the patriarch's call. He glanced at the sheephead disciple who he had previously obtained a lot of information from. He saw the man waving his hands with a red face, trying to squeeze into the crowd. He thought for a moment, then immediately grabbed Delphian's hand and retreated. Huang Hua and Mr. Liu in the crowd did not care about protecting themselves. Magadol was slightly worse, but his position was too far away from the nun princess, and he could not help her. Although the crowd seemed to be pushing in the direction where Fang Qi was, Brando was not too worried. After all, even if Fang Qi was unreliable, he was not someone that ordinary followers could do anything to. The shepherd did not notice Brendel's actions, because the smoke that suddenly rose up to create chaos blocked his view of the hall. He obviously did not expect such a thing to happen, and was stunned for a moment. Then he flew into a rage and shouted, "What are you doing? You bunch of idiots, she's at the back." He stomped his feet and shouted angrily. At the same time he ordered his followers and guards to separate the crowd. But at this time, the patriarch suddenly saw a small figure retreating rapidly along the wall of the holy temple. It was the opposite direction of the crowd, and it was heading towards the back door of the holy temple. The patriarch's heart trembled and suddenly remembered his mission. He did not care about the person who looked like a pagan intruder. He pointed in that direction and screamed, "It's her, go catch her, don't let her escape." Lotus was stumbling towards the back door of the hall. When she heard the scream, she could not help but tremble, but her footsteps quickened. Lute shouted under her hood, "We've been discovered, run." But just as she climbed onto the podium, she heard an angry roar, "Damn pagan, go to hell." She saw the high-ranking follower who previously presided over the ceremony on the altar with bloodshot eyes. He held a sacrificial dagger in his hand and rushed in her direction with a twisted face. Lotus was so scared that her face turned pale. In a moment of desperation, she forgot that there was a high-ranking sheephead disciple on the podium. For a moment, her hands and feet turned cold. But at this time, a fiery red light shot out from her hood and hit the dagger in the high-ranking follower's hand. With a ding sound, the dagger flew out of the high-ranking follower's hand and nailed into a nearby pillar. The high-ranking clergyman held his hand and screamed in agony. His entire arm was set ablaze. At this time, Brando just turned his head and saw this scene. He felt Odorfice in his hand faintly jump. He subconsciously turned his head and saw the high-ranking follower turn into a torch. Loot? As soon as Brando saw the sword light, he reacted. It was obviously the sword light of the little fairy Lute. He had seen it once outside the elemental barrier, and the white mist also told him that the latter's power was actually a projection of the holy sword Odorfice. So it was not surprising that the flaming blade could sense it. But in the chaos, the little fairy Lute apparently did not hear Brando's call. She killed the high-ranking follower with a sword and looked back to see Lotus still in a daze. He could not help but remind her angrily, "Don't be in a daze. Hurry up and leave this place. If we encounter the devil's avatar again, both of us will die." Only then did Lotus react. She did not have time to thank or be afraid. She hurriedly got up from the ground, carefully bypassed the high-ranking follower who was wailing and rolling on the ground, and ran in the direction of the back door behind the podium. But sometimes, the more you are afraid of something, the more you will encounter it. Originally, she was careful enough and was far enough away from the high-ranking follower. But suddenly, the sheephead follower screamed and grabbed her ankle with his left hand. The little girl screamed. How could her strength be compared to a high-ranking member of the sheephead cult? Not to mention the latter had used his strength before he died. She fell to the ground in an instant, and even the fairy in her hood was thrown out. Lute was caught off guard and fell several times on the gray wooden floor of the temple before he got up with a dirty face. He looked back and suddenly became anxious because he saw the sheephead follower who was covered in flames was holding Lotus's calf and desperately pulling her back, as if he wanted to hug her, and both of them died together. It was only a matter of 1 or 2 seconds. Even if it was him, he would not be able to save her in time. But at this time, there was a sudden roar in the hall, and a wave of air swept from the center of the hall. The wave of air passed through the podium, passed by the high-ranking follower who was holding Lotus, and passed by the little fairy Lute. Immediately the three of them were sent flying and hit the side of the wall. It turned out that Fang Qi, who was in the crowd, was finally annoyed by the followers who kept flocking to him. He no longer cared about hiding. He directly raised his strength to the highest level, and the surging elemental power immediately pushed in all directions. For a moment, there was a wave of expanding shock wave in the hall, exploding from the inside out. This shock wave was only slightly stronger than a strong wind to Brando and the others. It had no effect other than blowing their hair. But for the ordinary followers, this shock wave had become an invincible force. Those closest to the center were the first to be unlucky. They were unable to resist at all and were directly swept away by this force from the inside out. They hit the people behind them, and the people behind them were thrown off their feet. Like dominoes, they fell down one after another. The sheephead cult members were in a state of chaos. And his unintentional blow just happened to save Lotus' life. The little fairy Lute was caught off guard and his head hit the wall on the side of the podium. He was dizzy, but when he thought that Lotus was still in danger, he did not care that his whole body was falling apart. He turned over and got up from the ground, and just as he was about to look for the little girl's position, but he saw a figure quickly pass by him. He widened his eyes and saw that the figure suddenly rushed to the high-ranking follower beside Lotus. The figure hit the follower, and the high-ranking follower, who was half wrapped in flames, was knocked off the podium. That high-ranking clergyman was already half dead to begin with, and after being swept into a mess by the shockwave, he was knocked off the platform. His head hit the ground and he immediately fainted. Wrapped in flames, he lost all signs of life. Then Lute saw that the figure stopped and pulled up Lotus, who was sitting on the ground. He heard Lotus's surprised voice, "Sister. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."